My name is Aria Jackson. I am 18 years old. Last November, my parents left me to freeze in a dead Subaru during a blinding nor'easter while they carried my grandmother's casket into a church without me. They took my winter coat and the car keys. They told me if I stepped outside and shed a single tear in front of their business partners, my college tuition would be cut off by nightfall. I sat shivering in the driver's seat, watching the heavy oak doors close. I did not break the window. I did not cause a scene. Instead, I answered a phone call from my grandmother's estate attorney. By the time that brief conversation ended, the trap my father thought he set for me had become his own grave. Before I take you back to that freezing coastal morning, take a second to like and subscribe to Maria Tells Stories. Drop a comment telling me your age, where you are watching from, and what time it is right now. The windshield frosted thick with a crust of Maine sea salt and jagged November ice. Through the blurred glass, the gray Atlantic sky blended into the churning ocean just a few hundred yards away. A fierce wind howled off the water, rattling the frame of my old Subaru Outback. I sat in the passenger seat, my bare arms wrapped around my chest, wearing a thin black morning dress. The engine was off. The heater was dead. Every breath I exhaled bloomed into a white cloud of vapor that clung to the freezing window panes. I rubbed a small circle into the frost with the heel of my palm. My knuckles ached stiff and raw from the biting cold. Through that tiny clear patch, I watched my parents. Thomas and Brenda Jackson stood on the slippery cobblestone steps of a historic white-steepled church in Bar Harbor. They were flanked by 4 men in dark suits coordinating the awkward heavy lift of a polished mahogany casket. Inside that casket rested Ruth Jackson, the woman who spent the last decade teaching me how to patch cedar shingles bait traps and survive the long, dark New England winters. She was my grandmother, my anchor, and the only person in our family who possessed an ounce of genuine warmth. My father paused at the top of the church steps. He wore a pristine, custom-tailored charcoal suit that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of a coastal storm. He turned his head and shot a brief, sharp glare toward the parked Subaru. Even from 50 feet away, through a layer of ice, I felt the venom in his stare. He had orchestrated this isolation 10 minutes earlier, right as we pulled into the church parking lot. We were supposed to walk in together as a family. I had spent the entire silent car ride trying to swallow the lump of grief lodged in my throat. I held a crumpled tissue trying to dry my eyes before we faced the congregation. Thomas noticed my tears in the rearview mirror. His jaw tightened into a rigid, unforgiving line. He shifted the car into park, killed the engine, and unbuckled his seatbelt. He turned around and reached over the center console. He did not offer a comforting hand. He grabbed the sleeve of my heavy canvas winter coat resting on my lap and pulled it away from me. I blinked confused, my hands empty. I asked him what he was doing. Thomas leaned close, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding whisper. He pointed toward the church entrance where several prominent local developers and regional bank officers were gathering under black umbrellas. He told me those men held the keys to his commercial lobster distribution loans. He said his financial reputation depended on projecting strength and unbothered corporate stability. He looked at my red, swollen eyes and told me my flighty, dramatic emotions were an embarrassment. He said crying was for the weak. He informed me that I was a liability to his image today. Then he delivered the ultimatum. He pocketed the car keys and told me to stay put. He stated that if I stepped out of the vehicle, if I walked into that sanctuary and shed a single tear in front of his investors, he would call the university registrar the next morning. My tuition funding would cease. My dorm housing would be canceled. He promised to leave me stranded and broke before the end of my freshman semester. Brenda sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead at the dashboard. My mother did not intervene. She simply adjusted her pearl necklace, smoothing the lapels of her dark wool coat. She operated on the principle of self-preservation, aligning herself with whoever held the checkbook. She nodded once, validating his threat, and opened her door to step into the sleet. They locked me out of my own mourning process to protect a fragile business facade. They did not physically bind my hands. I was a legal adult. I could pull the handle, step out into the storm, and walk into the service. But the geographical and psychological trap was flawless. Bar Harbor in late November offers no mercy to someone walking miles in a thin dress without a coat. More importantly, Thomas knew I cherished my education. Studying marine biology at the University of Maine was my only escape route from his suffocating control. He weaponized my future to ensure my silence. I watched my father turn away from the Subaru and guide the pallbearers through the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary. The doors swung shut, sealing tight against the wind. The silence inside the car became deafening. The temperature plummeted. The cold seeped through the floorboards, creeping up my legs and settling deep into my chest. My teeth began to chatter, a rhythmic, hollow clicking sound in the empty cabin. I pulled my knees to my chest, trying to preserve whatever body heat I had left. The betrayal gnawed at my ribs. Ruth had been the true center of the Jackson family. While Thomas despised his working-class roots and chased white-collar prestige, Ruth ran a sprawling, weathered historic inn on the rocky coastline. She respected the fishermen, the harsh weather, and the value of a calloused hand. I spent my summers helping her sweep the wraparound porches and balance her ledger books. She taught me that independence was the only currency that mattered. Now, the man who spent his life running away from her legacy was treating her funeral like a networking event and treating me like a stray dog left in the yard. Have you ever been pushed out of your own grief by the exact people who were supposed to comfort you? How did you survive that isolation? I leaned my head against the frozen window. A fresh wave of hot tears spilled over my eyelashes, stinging my chilled skin. I wanted to scream. I wanted to kick the dashboard until the plastic cracked. The urge to throw open the door, march down the aisle, and disrupt his pristine corporate performance burned hot in my veins. But the fear of losing my university lifeline kept me paralyzed in the passenger seat. I felt small, discarded, and entirely powerless. Then the sudden jarring ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet. The device vibrated against the hard plastic of the center console, illuminating the dark interior of the car. I wiped my nose with the back of my trembling hand and squinted at the screen. The caller ID displayed a local Bangor number. I did not recognize it. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the glass. Most of the town was currently sitting in the pews 100 yards away. I picked up the phone and swiped the green icon, pressing the cold speaker to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I just listened. A gruff, weathered voice spoke on the other end, carrying the distinct clipped cadence of an old-school coastal Mainer. It was a voice that belonged on a commercial dock, not in an office, yet it commanded immediate attention. The man introduced himself as Elias Thorne. He told me he was Ruth's estate attorney, and he told me he knew exactly where I was sitting. I gripped the phone, pressing the cold screen against my ear. The voice on the other end possessed a rugged, gravelly texture. It was the sound of a man who had spent decades navigating the rigid, unyielding legal channels of coastal Maine. I did not know Elias Thorne personally, but I recognized his name. My grandmother Ruth used to mention him when she sorted her heavy ledger books on the porch of the historic inn she managed. She always described Elias as a man who treated the law like a sharp knife, useful and precise if handled correctly. I asked him how he knew where I was. I asked if he was standing outside in the sleet, watching me shiver in the passenger seat. Elias let out a low, humorless chuckle. He told me he was currently sitting in his warm office 60 miles away in Bangor. He said he did not need to be in Bar Harbor to see the board being played. He explained that my grandmother possessed a terrifying clarity regarding her own son. Ruth knew Thomas better than he knew himself. She understood his obsessive hunger for corporate validation and his deep-seated resentment toward the rugged, unpolished lifestyle of our coastal town. Elias told me Ruth predicted this exact scenario weeks before her lungs finally gave out. She sat in his law office and mapped out my father's probable actions with chilling accuracy. She told her attorney that Thomas would turn her funeral into a grotesque networking event to secure his lobster distribution loans. More importantly, she warned Elias that Thomas would view my genuine grief as a threat to his pristine, stoic image. She knew my father would find a way to exclude me, to lock me out of the mourning process, to ensure his business partners saw only a composed, victorious patriarch. Hearing Elias speak those words sent a strange electric current down my spine. The freezing air inside the Subaru seemed to lose its bite for a brief second. My grandmother had seen the trap being set long before I ever realized I was the prey. Elias issued his first directive. His tone was not gentle or comforting. It was a tactical command delivered by a general preparing a soldier for the front lines. He ordered me not to kick the dashboard. He told me not to pound my fists against the frosted glass and beg for entry into the sanctuary. He said causing a scene in the parking lot would only hand Thomas the exact ammunition he needed to justify cutting off my university tuition. The attorney told me my father wanted me to break down. Thomas wanted to point to my hysterical reaction as proof of my instability. Elias instructed me to deny him that satisfaction. He said the most dangerous thing a person can do to an arrogant man is to let him believe he has won the game. He told me to sit quietly in the freezing vehicle and let my father perform his hollow pantomime of grief for the bankers. I pulled my knees tighter to my chest. The logic was cold and undeniable. The frantic, desperate urge to force my way into the church began to dissolve. I took a slow, jagged breath, letting the freezing air fill my lungs. I asked Elias what I was supposed to do next. He told me the real battle was not happening in that church today. It was happening tomorrow morning. Elias informed me that a mandatory probate hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock in a wood-paneled courtroom in Bangor. He stated my presence was not merely a suggestion, it was a strict legal requirement. He explained that Ruth had filed a highly specific complex will that bypassed the standard inheritance protocols my father was anticipating. Elias refused to discuss the financial details over the phone, citing the need for strict legal confidentiality until the documents were presented to the judge. But the gravity in his voice conveyed the sheer magnitude of what was coming. He told me to wear a steady face tomorrow. He warned me that Thomas was walking into that courtroom expecting a swift, routine transfer of assets to pay off his mounting commercial debts. Elias said my father believed the historic inn and its sprawling deep-water acreage were already his property to liquidate. The narrative inside my head pivoted sharply. The crushing, heavy sorrow of losing my grandmother remained, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It morphed into a fierce, burning curiosity. Ruth was a woman who repaired cedar shingles in freezing rain and negotiated with ruthless seafood vendors. She never left a single detail to chance. If she required my presence at the reading of her will, she was positioning me on the board for a specific reason. Before ending the call, Elias mentioned one final detail. He said he possessed a physical item Ruth had entrusted to him shortly before her death. It was not a bank document or a property deed. He told me it was a heavy, antique brass compass. I knew the compass. It used to sit on the mahogany desk in her private office at the inn. The brass was tarnished green with age, and the glass cover bore a long, thin scratch across the center. As a child, I used to spin the dial watching the magnetic needle search for true north. Ruth always told me the compass belonged to a long line of Maine sailors who understood that the ocean did not care about a man's pride. The ocean only respected preparation and direction. Elias relayed my grandmother's final message regarding the object. He told me Ruth specifically asked him to place it in my hands tomorrow morning. He quoted her exact words, "She wanted you to have this to find your way." The line went quiet for a brief moment. I processed the weight of the message. It was not a sentimental farewell. It was a tool. It was an instrument designed for navigation through hostile territory. My grandmother knew the reading of the will was going to unleash a brutal, vicious storm within our family. She was handing me a compass because she knew I was about to be thrown into the deep end of a treacherous conflict. Elias told me to save my energy and conserve my heat. He promised to see me in Bangor at 9 sharp. He ended the call, leaving me alone once again in the quiet, isolated cabin of the car. I lowered the phone and set it on the center console. The dynamic of my imprisonment had fundamentally shifted. I looked out through the small, clear patch I had rubbed into the frosted window. The white steeple of the church stood stark against the gray, churning sky. Inside that building, my father was likely shaking hands, accepting condolences, and mentally calculating the profit margins of selling his mother's legacy to the highest bidder. He thought he possessed total control over my future and his own. I reached up and wiped the freezing tears from my cheeks. My knuckles still ached from the cold, but the violent, helpless shivering had stopped. A newfound rigid composure settled over my posture. The bitter coastal wind continued to howl, rattling the doors of the Subaru, but the vehicle no longer felt like a suffocating trap. The despair that pinned me to the passenger seat burned away. I leaned my head back against the headrest and stared at the digital clock glowing faintly on the dashboard. I realized I was not a discarded victim locked in a freezing box. I was a soldier sitting in a bunker, waiting for the sun to rise. Ruth had armed the trap and handed me the detonator. All I had to do was survive the next 20 hours. I sat in the profound silence, calculating my next move, anticipating the moment the church doors would finally open and my family would return to the car. The heavy oak doors of the coastal church finally swung outward, groaning against the relentless force of the November wind. A dense cluster of dark figures spilled onto the stone steps, bracing themselves against the driving sleet. I watched the procession through the small, jagged circle of clear glass I had carved into the frosted window with my thumbnail. The mourners huddled under wide black umbrellas, moving in a synchronized rush toward their heated vehicles. My father stood near the ornate entrance, gripping the hands of regional bankers and local developers. He nodded with a practiced solemnity, playing the role of the stoic grieving son to flawless precision. A lone figure broke away from the unified crowd and marched across the icy parking lot toward the Subaru. It was Clara. My older sister was 24 years old and possessed an uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous, shifting waters of our father's temper. Clara was the undeniable golden child of the family. She achieved that protected status not through exceptional talent or academic brilliance, but through unwavering compliance. She understood early on that survival in the Jackson household meant prioritizing Thomas and his fragile corporate ego above all else. She wore a tailored wool peacoat, her dark hair tucked neatly under a knitted cap, and carried a silver metal thermos in her gloved hands. Clara reached the driver's side door and pulled the handle. The frozen hinges shrieked in protest. She slid into the seat next to me, bringing a harsh gust of biting winter air into the cabin before pulling the door shut. She let out a long, shivering breath and unbuttoned her high collar. She turned to look at me. Her expression held a complicated, nuanced mixture of pity and bone-deep exhaustion. Clara did not fit the mold of a pure villain. She occupied the messy, treacherous middle ground of our family dynamic. She possessed enough empathy to recognize my physical suffering, but lacked the fundamental courage required to challenge the man causing it. She unscrewed the heavy cap of the silver thermos and held it out toward me. A thick ribbon of steam rose into the freezing air, carrying the rich, dark scent of roasted coffee. She told me to drink. She said she sneaked the beverage out of the church basement kitchen, knowing I had been sitting in the cold without a coat for over an hour. It was a rare sliver of genuine sisterly care, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of the physical torment I was enduring. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached out to take the metal cup. The heat radiated through my numb, rigid fingers, offering a fleeting, deceptive illusion of comfort. I brought the warm rim to my lips, but before I could take a single sip, Clara started talking. The brief moment of warmth evaporated instantly, replaced by the familiar enabling rhetoric she always deployed to shield our father from accountability. She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and told me I needed to stop acting like a victim. She said my sulking was making the entire funeral process harder for everyone involved. I lowered the cup, staring at her in stunned disbelief. I reminded her that our father confiscated my winter coat, took the car keys, and banished me to a dead vehicle during a winter storm simply because I shed a tear over our dead grandmother. Clara shook her head, dismissing my suffering as a minor inconvenient detail. She leaned over the center console and lowered her voice, treating the information like a classified corporate secret. She told me Thomas was drowning. She revealed the ugly truth hiding behind his tailored charcoal suit. His commercial lobster distribution business was hemorrhaging cash. The cost of diesel fuel and trap maintenance had skyrocketed. He had taken out a string of high-interest loans to purchase a fleet of new refrigerated transport trucks, and the regional banks were threatening to call in the debts. She pointed a gloved finger toward the church steps. She said the men standing under those umbrellas were the only investors keeping our family afloat. Clara looked me square in the eye and claimed my emotional presence would have derailed his critical networking opportunities. She said Thomas could not afford to manage a grieving, unpredictable teenage daughter while actively trying to save his distribution empire from imminent collapse. She demanded I show some grace and understand the crushing pressure resting on his shoulders. The audacity of her twisted logic snapped whatever fragile thread of restraint I had left holding me together. Elias Thorne had instructed me over the phone to remain calm and calculated. The seasoned attorney told me to hold my ground and wait for the probate hearing. But sitting in the passenger seat listening to my older sister justify my abuse in order to protect a fragile business facade stripped away my composure entirely. I was not a seasoned legal strategist. I was an 18-year-old girl who had just lost the only person in the world who truly loved her and taught her how to stand tall. I did not deliver a stoic, mature reply. I did not gaze at her with icy, cinematic resolve. I lost my temper in a raw, humiliating, and messy explosion of grief and rage. I screamed at her. The sound tore from my throat, raw, jagged, and unpolished. I asked her how she could sit there and defend a man who treated his own mother's funeral like a cheap real estate pitch. I yelled that Ruth deserved to be mourned properly, not leveraged for a commercial loan extension. Clara recoiled, her eyes widening in genuine shock. She reached out and told me to lower my voice, ordering me to stop being so hysterical before the passing mourners heard me. The word hysterical triggered a blind, visceral reaction. I threw my right arm out, swatting her hand away from my personal space. My wrist collided hard with the silver thermos she was still holding near my chest. The container jerked sideways. The scalding dark liquid launched into the air in a sudden chaotic arc. A thick wave of hot coffee splashed across my chest, soaking directly into the fabric of my pristine black morning dress. The heat seared through the thin material, stinging my cold skin. I gasped, dropping the metal cup onto the rubber floorboards. The spilled coffee pooled in the creases of my skirt, leaving a dark, spreading stain across my lap. The rich scent of the roasted beans turned sour and suffocating in the enclosed cabin. I sat there panting, my chest heaving, looking down at the ruined fabric clinging to my legs. The dark stain bleeding into my morning dress served as a grim, physical manifestation of the day's traumatic events. It functioned as heavy, unmistakable foreshadowing of the exact nature of the war to come. My family was not merely going to exclude me from saying a final goodbye to my grandmother. Their greed and their desperate, frantic scrambling for financial survival were going to permanently taint my grieving process. They were going to ruin every sacred memory of my grandmother, leaving an indelible toxic mark on the hardest and most pivotal year of my life. Clara stared at the spilled coffee dripping onto the floor mats. Her brief moment of sisterly compassion vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, rigid disgust. She did not offer a napkin. She did not ask if the hot liquid had burned my skin. She simply shook her head and called me a childish, unpredictable liability. She told me I had brought this entire situation upon myself. Clara stated that Thomas was right to lock me out because I was clearly incapable of controlling my temper in a civilized setting. She reached for the door handle and pushed it open, letting the bitter winter wind rush back into the vehicle. She stepped out into the sleet, slamming the heavy door shut behind her without looking back. I watched my sister march back across the icy parking lot to rejoin our parents. They huddled together under a large umbrella, forming a unified front, presenting a flawless image of coastal success to the departing bankers. I sat alone in the passenger seat. The initial searing heat of the spilled coffee quickly cooled, turning damp and freezing against my skin. The wet fabric clung to my legs, causing a fresh wave of unrelenting shivering to rack my body. The isolation I felt an hour ago returned, but the texture of the loneliness had changed. I was no longer waiting for their permission to exist. I stared down at the dark stain ruining my dress, wiping a stray tear from my cheek. I knew they were driving back to our house soon to calculate their anticipated inheritance and plot their financial rescue. I turned my gaze toward the gray horizon, visualizing the wood-paneled courtroom in Bangor, where the reading of the will would commence tomorrow morning. The drive to Bangor the next morning felt like navigating a frozen wasteland. The harsh coastal wind whipped across the narrow highways, carrying a thick flurry of wet snow that threatened to spin my old Subaru off the asphalt. The heater in the dashboard blasted hot, dry air, but the damp cold of my stained morning dress still clung to my bones. I had not slept. I spent the entire night huddled in my dorm room, ignoring the furious, frantic text messages my father sent after realizing I had slipped away before dawn. Thomas had threatened to cut off my university tuition if I embarrassed him at the funeral. I knew that defying his direct orders and showing up at the county courthouse uninvited would trigger an immediate catastrophic retaliation. But the heavy brass compass Elias Thorne had referenced echoed in my mind. I was not going to hide in the shadows while my father dissected my grandmother's legacy. I arrived at the Penobscot County Courthouse just before 9 o'clock. The building was an imposing structure of gray stone and heavy mahogany doors. The interior smelled of old paper lemon polish and quiet, desperate anxiety. I found the assigned probate chamber on the second floor and slipped into the back row, sliding onto a hard wooden pew. My parents and my sister were already seated near the front of the gallery. Thomas wore the same pristine, custom-tailored charcoal suit he wore to the funeral. He sat with his shoulders squared, projecting an aura of total commanding ownership. He was flanked by two sharp-looking corporate attorneys clutching thick leather portfolios. Brenda sat next to him, her posture rigidly perfect, her hair sprayed into a stiff, immaculate bob. Clara flanked her other side, typing rapidly on her phone. They looked like a triumphant royal family waiting for the formal coronation. They did not notice me sitting in the shadows near the heavy exit doors. Elias Thorne stood near the front podium, arranging a stack of legal documents. The veteran estate attorney wore a faded tweed jacket that looked wildly out of place against the polished corporate armor of my father's lawyers. Elias glanced toward the back of the room and made brief eye contact with me. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The heavy wooden door next to the bench swung open, and the probate judge took his seat. He was an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a weary expression that suggested he had witnessed decades of bitter family infighting. He slammed his gavel down, calling the session to order. The dull thud echoed through the silent, high-ceilinged chamber, signaling the beginning of the end for the Jackson family dynamic. Elias stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat. The gravelly texture of his voice carried effortlessly across the silent room. He stated for the official record that he was the appointed executor of Ruth Jackson's estate. He produced the original signed copy of the final will and testament, dated precisely 4 months prior to my grandmother's death. Thomas leaned back in his pew, crossing his arms over his chest. He wore a smug, confident expression, anticipating a dry, routine reading that would formally transfer the sprawling coastal property into his eager hands. Elias adjusted his reading glasses and began to read the document aloud. He started with the standard legal boilerplate, moving swiftly through the initial declarations. The tension in the room remained low until the attorney reached the second page, outlining the primary division of assets. Elias read the specific clause with slow, deliberate articulation. He stated that the entirety of the real property known as the Harbor View Inn, encompassing the historic structure and the adjoining 60 acres of pristine, deep-water coastal land, was to be placed into a newly established, irrevocable trust. The smug expression vanished from my father's face instantly. His arms dropped to his sides, and he leaned forward, gripping the back of the wooden pew in front of him. His corporate attorneys exchanged sharp, confused glances, opening their leather portfolios in a frantic scramble. An irrevocable trust fundamentally strips away the direct liquid control Thomas was counting on to secure his commercial loans. But Elias was not finished. He read the final devastating sentence of the clause. He announced that the sole named beneficiary and eventual controlling trustee of the Harbor View Inn Irrevocable Trust was not Thomas Jackson. It was not Clara Jackson. The sole inheritor of the entire multi-million-dollar coastal estate was 18-year-old Aria Jackson. The absolute silence that followed the declaration was deafening. The air in the courtroom seemed to evaporate instantly, sucked out of the room by the sheer staggering magnitude of the revelation. My grandmother had bypassed her own son completely. She leaped over the established patriarchal hierarchy, ignoring the golden child entirely, and handed the keys to her empire directly to the youngest, most discarded member of the family. The reaction in the gallery was explosive. Thomas froze, completely paralyzed. The arrogant color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw slackened. The flawless corporate vanity he spent decades cultivating shattered in real time under the weight of the public rejection. He stared at Elias with wide, unblinking eyes, unable to process the terrifying reality that his own mother had legally diagnosed him as entirely untrustworthy. Next to him, Brenda let out a sharp, ragged gasp. The rigid perfection of her posture collapsed. The realization that her carefully constructed lifestyle was built on a crumbling foundation hit her physical nervous system like a freight train. She brought a shaking hand to her chest, swaying violently to the left. She lost her balance completely and slumped heavily against the wooden divider of the pew. The sharp crack of her shoulder hitting the wood echoed in the silent room. Clara jumped up, dropping her phone onto the floor, screaming for someone to help. The bailiff stationed near the door rushed forward, grabbing Brenda's arm and helping hoist my mother back into an upright position. The scene devolved into a messy, humiliating public spectacle. Thomas finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock. The humiliation mutated instantly into a blind, ferocious rage. He stood up, shoving his way past his own attorneys, and yelled at Elias, demanding to see the signature on the document. He shouted that the will was a fraudulent fabrication, a sick joke, orchestrated by an incompetent lawyer. The judge slammed his gavel down repeatedly, threatening to hold my father in contempt of court and have him forcibly removed by the armed deputies if he did not sit down immediately. Thomas sank back onto the wooden bench, his chest heaving. His attorneys huddled around him, speaking in rapid, hushed, frantic whispers. The chaos in the front row allowed me to catch fragments of their panicked crosstalk. The snippets of conversation carried across the quiet chamber, revealing a terrifying, desperate secret. I heard one of the corporate lawyers tell my father they needed to file an emergency injunction by noon. The lawyer hissed that the luxury developers from Massachusetts were arriving tomorrow morning to sign the preliminary purchase agreements. A cold, sickening dread settled into the pit of my stomach. The puzzle pieces locked together, forming a horrifying picture. Thomas had not been planning to inherit the historic inn and run the family business. He had already secretly promised the sprawling deep-water acreage to a group of out-of-state luxury real estate developers. He intended to bulldoze the century-old inn, clear-cut the ancient pine forests, and allow a massive corporate entity to pave over my grandmother's legacy with high-end waterfront condominiums. The massive cash payout from the developers was the exact financial lifeline he needed to clear the mounting debts of his failing lobster distribution company. Ruth's will did not just enrich me. It single-handedly destroyed my father's illicit backroom deals. It severed the financial lifeline he had built to save himself from total ruin. My grandmother knew he was planning to sell the soul of the coastline, and she threw an 18-year-old girl directly into his path to stop the bulldozers. The judge finalized the preliminary hearing, ordering a formal secondary review due to the unexpected complexity of the trust assignment. He dismissed the gallery. I sat glued to the back pew, watching my parents scramble to exit the courtroom, avoiding eye contact with anyone. I remained hidden in the shadows until the heavy mahogany doors closed behind them. The initial shock of the inheritance slowly faded, replaced by a terrifying awareness of the target now painted squarely on my back. My father was a drowning man, looking at a long prison sentence for commercial loan default, and I was currently holding the only life raft. He was not going to let an 18-year-old college freshman stand between him and his survival. I gathered my canvas tote bag and walked out of the silent chamber, knowing the real war was just about to begin. The drive back to the university campus in Orono was a blur of adrenaline and creeping terror. The explosive revelations in the Bangor courtroom had completely upended my reality. I was an 18-year-old girl who woke up that morning expecting to lose her college tuition for crying at a funeral, and by noon, I was the sole heir to a multi-million-dollar coastal empire. The sprawling historic inn and the pristine deep-water acreage were entirely mine. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to process the staggering weight of the legacy Ruth had placed squarely on my shoulders. I felt an initial surge of protective pride, imagining how I could honor her memory and preserve the rugged coastal land she loved so fiercely. But the soaring high of the inheritance was brutally short-lived. The retaliation my father unleashed moved faster than the incoming winter storm. I parked my Subaru in the student lot and walked into the cramped brick building of my dormitory. The narrow hallways smelled of cheap microwave noodles and industrial floor cleaner. I unlocked the door to my small shared room, dropping my canvas tote bag onto my narrow twin bed. The flashing red light on my laptop caught my attention. I opened the screen and logged into my student portal. 4 unread emails sat in my inbox, all marked with urgent red flags from the University Bursar's office and the Department of Student Housing. I clicked open the first message. The clinical bureaucratic language delivered the fatal blow. Thomas Jackson had formally withdrawn his financial authorization for my academic account. He canceled the automatic tuition payments and officially removed himself as the primary guarantor on my student loans. A second email from the housing department confirmed the nightmare. Because my father had withdrawn his signature as a financial co-signer, my dormitory contract was immediately invalidated. True to his threat in the freezing Subaru, Thomas did not hesitate to sever my lifeline. He executed a flawless, merciless financial strangulation. The university demanded full payment of the remaining semester balance within 10 business days, or I would face immediate academic suspension. Furthermore, I was given exactly 2 weeks to vacate the dormitory premises. I stared at the glowing laptop screen, my chest tightening. I was 18 years old, with less than $200 sitting in a basic student checking account. The sprawling coastal estate I inherited might as well have existed on the moon. I picked up my phone and frantically dialed Elias Thorne, praying the seasoned estate attorney could authorize an emergency disbursement from the trust to cover my tuition and secure an off-campus apartment. Elias answered on the third ring. His voice lacked the commanding grit it held in the courtroom earlier that morning. He sounded weary, carrying the heavy burden of explaining the unforgiving machinery of the probate system to a desperate teenager. I asked him to release a fraction of the funds. I pleaded for just enough cash to keep my housing contract active and satisfy the bursar's office. I told him my father was attempting to force me onto the street in the middle of a brutal Maine winter. Elias let out a long, heavy sigh. He delivered the first major legal obstacle, destroying any illusion of immediate rescue. The attorney explained that Thomas had not retreated to lick his wounds after the disastrous will reading. The moment he walked out of the Bangor courthouse, my father directed his corporate lawyers to file an aggressive formal contest against Ruth's will. Thomas was legally claiming that I had exerted undue influence over an elderly woman suffering from diminished mental capacity. He was asserting that I manipulated my grandmother into changing the inheritance documents on her deathbed. Elias stated the grim reality of the legal maneuver. Because the will was now actively contested, the entire estate was immediately frozen by the probate judge. The historic inn, the deep-water acreage, and the operational bank accounts tied to the property were locked down under a strict judicial hold. Elias informed me that he possessed absolutely zero legal authority to distribute a single penny from the trust until the contest was resolved in a court of law. I asked him how long a contested probate trial would take to resolve. Elias paused, hesitating before delivering the final crushing blow. He told me the court dockets were severely backlogged. He warned me that scheduling depositions, gathering medical records, and securing a trial date would take a minimum of 8 grueling months. The stark juxtaposition of my situation was agonizing. I was legally a millionaire on paper, holding the deed to a massive coastal fortune, but in practical reality, I was entirely destitute. I could not access the wealth to save myself from immediate ruin. My father had successfully trapped me in a horrific paradox. He knew the legal system would freeze the assets tying my hands behind my back while he systematically starved me out in the real world. Elias promised to fight the contest vigorously, but he pragmatically advised me to seek immediate employment and secure alternative living arrangements. He apologized for the harsh news and ended the call, leaving me to face the terrifying silence of my dorm room. The phone slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered onto the thin mattress. The walls of the tiny cinder-block room seemed to close in around me, compressing the oxygen in the air. I had 14 days before the university security staff would arrive to change the locks and escort me off the premises. The biting November wind howled against the single-pane window, rattling the glass and forcing a bitter draft into the room. The Maine winter was notoriously unforgiving, burying the landscape under feet of heavy snow and plunging temperatures far below freezing. Navigating that brutal environment without a safe, warm place to sleep was not just uncomfortable, it was physically dangerous. The stoic resolve that carried me through the courtroom confrontation shattered completely. I dropped to my knees on the cheap industrial carpet, pulling a box of heavy-duty black trash bags from under my bed. I began packing my meager belongings. I shoved textbooks, winter sweaters, and handfuls of loose socks into the plastic bags, my hands shaking uncontrollably. A raw, messy sob ripped through my chest. I sat back on my heels, burying my face in my hands, crying openly in the empty room. The sheer scale of my father's cruelty was overwhelming. He was not just contesting a legal document. He was actively, maliciously trying to break my spirit by subjecting me to the terror of homelessness. He wanted me to freeze. He wanted me to starve. He expected me to crawl back to the family house in Bar Harbor, begging for a warm bed and offering to sign over my grandmother's legacy in exchange for a hot meal. I wiped the tears from my cheeks, leaving a smear of dark mascara across my knuckles. The profound isolation was terrifying, but beneath the panic, a hardened, stubborn fury began to solidify. I looked around the half-packed room, staring at the black trash bags leaning against the cinder-block wall. I refused to give him the satisfaction of a surrender. I refused to let the luxury developers bulldoze Ruth's historic inn to save my father's fragile corporate ego. I zipped my winter coat up to my chin, bracing myself for the punishing road ahead. I needed to find a job that would pay cash immediately, and I needed to figure out how to survive the next 8 months entirely on my own. The desperate scramble to secure a job became my sole focus over the next 4 days. I printed out a stack of flimsy paper resumes using the last remaining credits on my university printing account. I drove my rattling Subaru down the winding coastal roads, searching for any business willing to hire a college student with zero professional experience and a desperate need for immediate cash. The bitter coastal wind whipped across the frozen asphalt, stripping the last dead leaves from the oak trees. The physical landscape of Maine felt as harsh and unforgiving as my current reality. I finally secured an interview at a large commercial fish packing plant located on the industrial edge of the harbor. The supervisor took one look at my pale, exhausted face and offered me a grueling overnight shift sorting and packing frozen herring. The pay was slightly above minimum wage, but it offered the immediate income I needed to rent a cheap, off-campus room before the university officially kicked me out of the dormitory. Before starting my first night shift, I stopped at a small, weathered diner situated near the commercial docks. The establishment was a local institution, famous for its thick, hearty fish chowder and strong black coffee. It was the kind of place where rugged lobstermen wearing heavy waterproof boots gathered to escape the biting cold and trade stories about the unpredictable Atlantic swells. I used to come here with my grandmother sharing a bowl of chowder after spending the morning patching the cedar shingles on her historic inn. I pushed through the heavy wooden door, pulling my woolen scarf tight around my neck. The diner smelled of fried clams, melted butter, and damp wool. The warmth of the room offered a brief, comforting reprieve from the freezing wind outside. I walked toward an empty booth in the corner, keeping my eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. I slid into the cracked vinyl seat and picked up a laminated menu. The low hum of conversation in the diner suddenly shifted. The easy, comfortable chatter among the locals died down, replaced by a sharp, uncomfortable silence. I felt the heavy collective weight of a dozen stares burning into the side of my face. I glanced up from the menu. 2 tables away, a group of seasoned lobstermen sat nursing mugs of coffee. These were men who had known my family for decades. They relied on Thomas Jackson's commercial distribution company to purchase their daily catch and transport it down the eastern seaboard. They were hard-working, fiercely loyal men who valued the rigid hierarchy of the coastal fishing industry. One of the older fishermen, a man with a thick gray beard and a faded canvas jacket, leaned across his table. He did not bother lowering his voice. He spoke with the distinctive clipped cadence of a true downeaster, ensuring his words carried perfectly across the small room. He scoffed, shaking his head in sheer disgust. He muttered loudly about the greedy college kid sitting in the corner. He told his companions it was a damn shame watching a spoiled teenager steal her poor, hard-working father's inheritance right out from under him. Another man chimed in, nodding his head in solemn agreement. He added that exploiting a dementia-riddled old woman on her deathbed was a sick, cruel way to get ahead in life. He expressed deep sympathy for Thomas, claiming my father was a good, honest businessman who did not deserve to be swindled by his own flesh and blood. The toxic words hit me like a physical blow. The air in the diner seemed to evaporate instantly. I stared at the men, my heart hammering against my ribs. The horrific efficiency of my parents' smear campaign was staggering. Thomas and Brenda had not just filed a vicious legal contest in the privacy of a Bangor courtroom. They had aggressively weaponized the local gossip mill. My father used his prominent status as a regional distributor to poison the tight-knit coastal community against me. He painted himself as the honorable, grieving son, fighting to protect his mother's legacy from a manipulative, unstable teenager. He spun a fabricated narrative claiming Ruth was suffering from severe cognitive decline and that I had coerced her into signing away the family estate during her final vulnerable days. The narrative utilized heavy dramatic irony. The town firmly believed Thomas was the victim. They viewed him as a pillar of the community, unfairly targeted by a ruthless, greedy heir. They had absolutely no idea about the secret massive debts he had accumulated. They did not know he had already promised the sprawling deep-water acreage to out-of-state luxury developers. They were completely unaware that he planned to bulldoze the very historic inn they thought he was trying to save. The sheer infuriating injustice of the situation paralyzed me. I sat in the cracked vinyl booth, gripping the edge of the laminated menu, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to stand up and scream the truth. I wanted to march over to their table and expose my father as a manipulative fraud who locked his daughter in a freezing car during a funeral just to protect his fragile corporate ego. I wanted to tell them Thomas was planning to sell the soul of the Maine coastline to build luxury waterfront condominiums for wealthy tourists. But I knew the brutal reality of small-town dynamics. If I caused a scene in the diner yelling defensive accusations at respected local fishermen, it would only confirm my father's narrative. It would make me look exactly like the unstable, hysterical teenager Thomas claimed I was. The town was loyal to the man who signed their paychecks. They would never believe an 18-year-old girl over a seasoned businessman. How do you defend your character when your own parents are convincing your hometown that you are a manipulator? Do you fight back or walk away? I swallowed the bitter lump of humiliation lodged in my throat. I set the menu down on the sticky table. I did not order the hot fish chowder I desperately craved to warm my freezing bones. I slid out of the booth, pulling my winter coat tight around my chest. I walked toward the exit, keeping my chin raised high, refusing to give the glaring locals the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I pushed through the heavy wooden door, stepping back out into the biting November wind. The psychological toll of the isolation crashed over me the moment I reached the safety of my old Subaru. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I gripped the cold steering wheel, my chest heaving with silent, dry sobs. The financial strangulation was terrifying, but the complete character assassination was deeply agonizing. I felt entirely alienated in my own hometown. The people I had grown up around, the community that shaped my identity, now viewed me as a pariah. I was fighting a massive legal war against a seasoned corporate machine, and I was doing it completely alone in the dark. I started the engine, the rattling sound filling the quiet cabin. I wiped my face, leaving a smear of dirt across my cheek. I had to report to the commercial fish packing plant in 2 hours to begin my grueling overnight shift. I had to stand in a freezing warehouse sorting frozen herring until dawn just to earn enough cash to survive the week. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the diner, the hostile whispers still echoing in my ears, knowing I had to endure this brutal existence for the next 8 months until the probate trial finally commenced. The fish packing plant sat on the very edge of the commercial harbor, a massive corrugated metal building that hummed with the constant drone of industrial refrigeration units. It was a bleak, unforgiving environment. For the next 3 weeks, my entire existence was reduced to a brutal, exhausting loop. I clocked in at 10 o'clock at night, putting on a thick rubber apron and heavy waterproof gloves. I stood on a wet concrete floor for 8 hours under harsh fluorescent lights, sorting thousands of frozen herring on a fast-moving stainless steel conveyor belt. The air inside the warehouse was kept at a steady 38 degrees, preserving the catch, but slowly freezing the feeling out of my fingers and toes. The physical labor was gruesome and relentless. My hands were constantly covered in icy fish blood and silver scales. The pungent, overpowering stench of brine and raw seafood seeped deep into the fabric of my clothes and embedded itself into my skin. But the grueling night shift carried a profound, heavy symbolism that kept me standing on that concrete floor when every muscle in my back screamed for rest. Working on the packing line, surrounded by rugged, tired locals scraping by on minimum wage, represented the authentic, hardworking soul of Maine culture. It was the gritty, unglamorous reality of coastal survival that my grandmother Ruth respected so deeply. She built her historic inn to honor this rugged identity, offering a warm hearth against the bitter Atlantic storms. My father despised this world. Thomas viewed the calloused hands of the fishermen as a stain on his corporate ambition. His desperate scheme to bulldoze the century-old inn, clear-cut the ancient pine forests, and construct sterile, out-of-state luxury condos symbolized the total destruction of that very identity. I realized during those long, freezing nights that I was not just fighting a legal battle over a piece of inherited real estate. I was fighting to preserve the authentic soul of my state against a man willing to pave over his own history to save his fragile pride. I finished my shifts at 6 a.m, walking out into the freezing pre-dawn darkness with aching joints and numb feet. I drove straight from the harbor to the university campus, sleeping for barely 2 hours in my old Subaru before rushing to my morning lectures. I managed to scrape together enough cash from my first few paychecks to rent a tiny, unheated room above a local hardware store, avoiding the imminent threat of dormitory eviction. But the sheer physical and mental exhaustion began to take a catastrophic toll. I attended my university classes in a total daze, struggling to keep my eyes open while the professors lectured. The heavy scent of industrial brine clung to my hair, drawing confused, irritated glances from the other students sitting near me in the crowded lecture halls. I felt entirely alienated, existing as a sleep-deprived ghost, navigating a world of bright, ambitious teenagers who had absolutely no idea what it felt like to be hunted by their own parents. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday morning during a critical marine biology midterm. The exam was not a standard multiple-choice test. It was a complex, detailed written proposal focusing on coastal ecology and the environmental impact of commercial development on the delicate shoreline ecosystems. It was a subject I was fiercely passionate about, a topic that directly mirrored the real-world battle I was waging over my grandmother's pristine, deep-water acreage. I had spent weeks compiling research notes intending to draft a flawless academic argument. But as I sat in the silent lecture hall gripping my pen, staring down at the blank exam booklet, my brain simply refused to function. The severe sleep deprivation caught up with me all at once. The words on the page blurred together, turning into meaningless squiggles. A heavy, thick fog settled over my cognitive processing. I tried to force myself to write, but my hand was shaking so badly from sheer fatigue that the ink scrawled erratically across the paper. The deafening hum of the fish packing plant echoed phantom noises in my ears. I could not recall a single specific ecological term or statistical data point. My mind was entirely blank. I sat there for 45 minutes watching the other students furiously scribble their brilliant proposals while my booklet remained agonizingly empty. The realization that I was about to fail a crucial midterm in my major, the very degree I was starving myself to pay for, crashed over me with crushing weight. The professor called time, instructing the students to pass their booklets to the front of the room. I slowly gathered my belongings, feeling a hollow, sickening despair settle into my chest. I waited until the lecture hall cleared out before walking down the carpeted steps toward the front podium. Professor Miller was a rugged, pragmatic man in his late 50s. He wore faded flannel shirts and possessed the weathered, deeply tanned skin of a man who spent his summers researching tidal pools along the rocky coast. He was a native Mainer who did not tolerate lazy excuses or academic shortcuts. I handed him my nearly blank exam booklet. My hand trembled violently. I opened my mouth, intending to offer a stoic professional apology for my poor performance. Instead, the final fragile thread holding my composure together snapped. A ragged, exhausted sob ripped through my chest. I broke down crying uncontrollably right in front of the podium. The humiliating, messy tears streamed down my face, cutting tracks through the exhaustion and the lingering smell of fish blood. I could not stop the crying. I stood there sobbing heavily, overwhelmed by the crushing pressure of the legal war, the hostile town gossip, the freezing night shifts, and the terrifying reality that my father was successfully destroying my future. Professor Miller did not gasp in shock. He did not offer sweet, coddling words of comfort or gently pat my shoulder. The rugged coastal culture does not breed soft, sentimental reactions. He looked down at the blank exam booklet in his hands and then looked back up at my red, swollen eyes. He noticed the dark bags under my eyes and the faint, unmistakable scent of industrial brine clinging to my winter coat. He recognized the distinct physical markers of a student who was working the grueling harbor shifts just to survive. He set the booklet down on the wooden podium. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of the desk. He spoke with a firm, steady pragmatism that anchored my spiraling panic. He told me he did not know what kind of storm I was currently navigating outside of his classroom, but he knew I was drowning. He said he remembered my fierce participation during the early weeks of the semester, and he knew a blank paper did not reflect my actual capability. Professor Miller reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a fresh blank exam booklet. He slid it across the podium toward me. He did not offer me a free pass. He offered me a lifeline built on hard expectations. He told me I had exactly 48 hours to return to his office with a fully researched, comprehensive proposal on coastal ecology. He stated that if I handed him another blank page on Thursday morning, he would fail me without hesitation. But he was giving me the window of time I desperately needed to catch my breath and prove my worth. I stared at the blank booklet, my chest heaving with lingering sobs. The strict, pragmatic extension was the most genuine, authentic display of support I had received since Elias Thorne handed me the brass compass. It showcased the harsh but fiercely loyal support system that existed in the coastal community outside of my toxic nuclear family. I wiped my face, nodding my head in silent, profound gratitude. I took the fresh booklet and walked out of the lecture hall, carrying a renewed spark of determination, knowing I had to utilize this academic lifeline to build the exact weapon I needed to save my grandmother's legacy. The 48-hour extension Professor Miller granted me was a crucial lifeline, but it required a grueling sacrifice. I skipped 2 consecutive night shifts at the fish packing plant, trading my meager hourly wages for the time needed to draft the coastal ecology proposal. I sat in my freezing, unheated room, wrapped in 2 heavy blankets, typing furiously on my laptop until my fingers cramped. I poured every ounce of my frustration and passion into the academic paper, detailing the catastrophic environmental impact of unchecked commercial development on the fragile Maine shoreline. I handed the completed booklet to Professor Miller early Thursday morning, feeling a profound sense of academic redemption, but the lost wages meant I was officially eating into the last of my tiny cash reserves. The brief victory of surviving the midterm was shattered later that afternoon when my phone rang. It was Elias Thorne. The estate attorney did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me to drive to his office in Bangor immediately. The sharp urgency in his gravelly voice triggered a cold spike of anxiety in my chest. I drove through the gray afternoon, the threat of an impending snowstorm hanging heavy in the coastal air. I walked into Elias's wood-paneled office, shedding my damp winter coat. The attorney sat behind his massive oak desk, surrounded by tall stacks of legal files and thick manila envelopes. He looked older today, the deep lines around his eyes etched with a weary frustration. He gestured for me to sit in the leather chair across from him, sliding a thick stapled document across the polished desk. Elias delivered the second major legal obstacle, and it was terrifying. He told me we were no longer just fighting Thomas's malicious will contest. We were now fighting a rapidly ticking clock against a massive regional bank. Elias explained the horrifying complication. 3 years ago, when my grandmother was beginning to show the first physical signs of physical frailty, Thomas convinced her that the historic inn required urgent, expensive structural renovations. He presented her with a towering stack of dense, confusing financial paperwork, claiming he was securing a low-interest loan to replace the aging cedar roof and upgrade the failing plumbing system. Ruth trusted her son to handle the administrative details. She signed the documents where he pointed. But Thomas did not secure a standard renovation loan. He tricked my grandmother into co-signing a massive $150,000 home equity line of credit directly against the commercial deed of the inn. Thomas immediately drained the entire line of credit, funneling the cash into his failing lobster distribution company to cover his mounting diesel and transport debts. The roof was never repaired. The plumbing was never upgraded. Elias tapped his pen against the document sitting between us. He stated the grim reality. The bank had not received a single monthly payment since Ruth passed away. The account was now severely delinquent. The regional bank officially issued a notice of default and was aggressively moving to foreclose on the historic property. I stared at the attorney, my heart hammering against my ribs. I asked him how a bank could foreclose on a property that was currently frozen in a contested probate battle. I assumed the judicial hold protected the assets from outside creditors until the trial concluded. Elias leaned forward, his expression turning grim. He explained the suffocating genius of my father's legal trap. We were not fighting a standard bank foreclosure. We were fighting my father's calculated malicious motion from the inside. Thomas was using the massive debt he secretly created as the ultimate weapon to bypass the frozen trust. My father had directed his corporate attorneys to actively petition the probate judge demanding an emergency estate liquidation sale. Thomas was arguing to the court that the estate was actively depreciating in value due to the mounting bank penalties. He claimed that the only responsible fiduciary action was to immediately liquidate the entire coastal property before the bank seized it and auctioned it off for a total loss. Elias laid out the devastating consequences if the judge granted the motion. If the court approved the liquidation sale, the property would be rushed to a private commercial auction. Thomas had already orchestrated the outcome. His out-of-state luxury developer partners were waiting in the wings, ready to bid on the sprawling, deep-water acreage. Because it was a distressed forced sale, the developers would buy the multi-million-dollar pristine coastal land for absolute pennies on the dollar. The proceeds of the cheap sale would pay off the bank lien and cover the probate legal fees, leaving virtually nothing left in the trust. Thomas would successfully wipe out his massive hidden debt, secure the lucrative kickback from the developers, and completely erase my inheritance before I ever legally owned the deed. The trap was flawless. The legal machinery was suffocating. I was 18 years old, flat broke, and trying to untangle a sophisticated corporate real estate scheme designed by a man desperate to avoid federal tax evasion charges. I asked Elias how much time we had before the judge ruled on the liquidation motion. The attorney checked a calendar on his desk. He told me the probate judge scheduled the emergency hearing for the second week of January. We had roughly 6 weeks to figure out how to stop the motion. Elias stated bluntly that the only guaranteed way to kill the liquidation petition and save the property was to legally cure the bank default. I needed to hand the regional bank a certified check for $150,000 within 45 days. The sheer staggering impossibility of the number hit me like a physical blow. I was currently debating whether I could afford to turn on the small space heater in my rented room for more than 2 hours a night. Earning $150,000 working the overnight shift at a fish packing plant was a mathematical delusion. Even if I worked 24 hours a day for the next decade, I would never amass that kind of liquid capital. Elias watched the panic rise in my eyes. He did not offer empty, comforting platitudes. The rugged, pragmatic Maine lawyer told me that weeping over the injustice of the situation would not delay the court docket. He told me I had 45 days to find a massive pile of money or wave goodbye to my grandmother's legacy forever. He advised me to start thinking less like a grieving granddaughter and more like a ruthless coastal businesswoman. I left the law office feeling a cold, heavy dread settling deep into my bones. The dark winter afternoon had faded into a pitch-black, freezing evening. I sat in my rattling Subaru staring at the dashboard clock, the ticking numbers mirroring the aggressive, rapid countdown ticking away my future. The town gossip and the hostile glares at the local diner felt like minor inconveniences compared to the massive financial execution my father just set in motion. I put the car in gear, driving back toward the harbor, knowing I had to return to the gruesome blood-stained packing line tonight to earn $60 while trying to figure out how to secure a small fortune before the snow truly began to fall. The punishing rhythm of the next 3 weeks stripped away whatever fragile optimism I had left. I existed in a brutal, exhausting state of perpetual motion. I hauled frozen boxes of herring on the midnight shift, slept for 3 hours in my freezing rented room, and attended my morning lectures, struggling to comprehend complex marine biology concepts through a thick fog of physical fatigue. The impending deadline for the $150,000 bank lien loomed over me like an executioner's axe. I scoured the university library computers, searching for obscure historic preservation grants or rural development loans. But every single application required months of bureaucratic processing and stringent financial guarantees I could not provide. I was running out of time, running out of money, and rapidly running out of physical strength. It was a bitter Thursday morning in mid-December. The temperature had plunged to 5 degrees, forcing a thick layer of ice to coat the harbor docks. I finished a grueling 9-hour shift at the packing plant, clocking out just as the sky began to bleed a pale, bruised purple. My hands were numb, hidden inside cheap wool gloves that smelled heavily of dried fish blood and industrial salt. I trudged across the frozen asphalt of the employee parking lot, my head down, bracing against the biting wind whipping off the dark Atlantic water. I reached for the icy door handle of my Subaru, but a sudden movement in the periphery of my vision made me freeze. A sleek black luxury SUV was parked in the empty space next to my battered car. The tinted windows rolled down with a smooth, mechanical hum. My parents were sitting inside the heated leather cabin. I took a slow, cautious step backward, my heavy rubber boots crunching against the ice. Thomas and Brenda stepped out of their expensive vehicle, pulling their tailored wool coats tight against the freezing harbor wind. They did not look like the triumphant regal couple who held court at the Bangor courthouse a few weeks ago. The stress of the mounting debts and the aggressive legal pushback from Elias Thorne had taken a visible toll. My mother looked significantly older. The rigid, frugal Maine stoicism she usually projected was cracking under the immense pressure. The skin around her eyes appeared papery, and her immaculate posture slouched slightly against the bitter cold. She looked at my brine-soaked boots and the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes with a complicated mixture of pity and calculated desperation. Thomas did not waste time with polite maternal greetings. He stepped forward, blocking my path to the driver's side door of my car. He looked around the bleak industrial parking lot, the rusting corrugated metal of the packing plant standing in stark contrast to his pristine corporate aesthetic. He spoke with a low, rapid urgency, trying to sound like a pragmatic businessman offering a logical solution to a stubborn problem. He told me the legal war was destroying the family. He said the escalating attorney fees were bleeding his accounts dry, and the constant stress was making Brenda physically ill. He framed the situation not as a battle he maliciously started, but as a mutual tragedy we needed to end immediately. Then Thomas delivered the ambush. He offered me a settlement. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a crisp white envelope, holding it out toward me in the freezing wind. He laid out the terms of the deal with the slick, polished delivery of a seasoned salesman closing a high-stakes negotiation. Thomas promised to immediately pay off the staggering $150,000 bank lien, resolving the imminent foreclosure threat. He swore he would personally call the university bursar's office and reinstate his financial guarantee, paying my remaining tuition in full for the next 4 years. He told me I could quit the grueling, gruesome night shifts at the fish plant today. He promised I could move back into a warm, comfortable dormitory and return to being a normal, carefree college student. But the final term of the settlement was the most intoxicating bait. He tapped the white envelope. He claimed it contained a certified cashier's check for $50,000. He called it a generous cash stipend, a good faith peace offering to ensure I had a comfortable financial cushion to start my adult life. All I had to do to secure the massive financial rescue was sign a single piece of paper. He wanted me to sign a quitclaim deed legally surrendering all my rights and interests in the Harborview Inn over to him. I stood paralyzed on the frozen asphalt, the bitter wind biting at my exposed cheeks. The settlement offer was a perfectly constructed red herring. It dangled the exact illusion of safety and comfort I was desperately craving. The urge to surrender was physically overpowering. My muscles ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The persistent smell of fish blood clinging to my clothes made me nauseous. The thought of fighting a massive regional bank, dodging hostile glares in my hometown, and enduring another 8 months of abject poverty felt like an impossible mountain to climb. My father was offering me a golden ladder to climb down from the freezing execution block. He was offering me a warm bed, my college degree, and a massive pile of cash. I looked at Brenda. My mother pulled her coat tighter, shivering in the wind. She begged me to take the deal. She said the historic inn was nothing but a crumbling money pit that would only drag me down into debt. She told me Ruth was an old, stubborn woman who did not understand the modern economy. She pleaded with me to let Thomas handle the business so I could focus on my marine biology studies. The psychological trap was suffocating. They were utilizing the exhaustion they intentionally created to force my submission. They starved me, isolated me, and froze me out just to make this exact moment feel like a rescue instead of a robbery. I stared at the white envelope in my father's hand. $50,000 would change my entire reality. I could buy a reliable car, rent a decent apartment, and buy real groceries instead of surviving on cheap noodles. I could go back to being a normal 18-year-old girl. I reached my hand out, my numb fingers hovering inches away from the envelope. Thomas smiled, a small, tight, victorious smirk creeping onto his face. He believed he had finally broken me. He thought the rugged Maine grit Ruth tried to instill in me had finally frozen to death in the harbor parking lot. That small, arrogant smirk triggered a tiny spark of defensive rage deep in my chest. It reminded me of the exact expression he wore when he pocketed my car keys and locked me in the freezing Subaru during the funeral. He was not offering a peace treaty. He was buying my submission. I pulled my hand back, dropping it to my side. I looked my father square in the eye, my voice shaking violently from the biting cold and the sheer adrenaline pumping through my veins. I told him I needed 48 hours to review the quitclaim deed with my attorney. Thomas frowned, his victorious smirk vanishing instantly. He tried to press the envelope into my hand, insisting the deal expired today. He warned me that the luxury developers were growing impatient, and if I delayed the signing, the massive cash offer would disappear forever. I refused to touch the paper. I stepped around him, unlocked my rattling Subaru, and threw myself into the freezing driver's seat. I slammed the door shut, locking it before he could grab the handle. I started the engine, the loud mechanical roar drowning out whatever final threat he tried to shout through the glass. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the parking space, leaving my parents standing in the bleak industrial lot. I drove away from the harbor, my chest heaving with silent, frantic sobs. The temptation to surrender was terrifyingly strong. I genuinely considered throwing in the towel, calling Elias to cancel the legal war, and letting the out-of-state developers bulldoze the legacy my grandmother spent a lifetime building. I needed to figure out if holding on to my pride was truly worth freezing to death before the 48-hour window closed and the golden lifeline disappeared. The 48-hour window to accept the settlement gnawed at my sanity. The white envelope Thomas held in the freezing parking lot haunted my exhausted thoughts. I wanted to surrender. I craved the warmth of a secure dormitory and the quiet luxury of studying marine biology without the smell of industrial brine clinging to my skin. But before the deadline expired, the legal machinery dragged me back into the crosshairs. Elias Thorne had scheduled a mandatory deposition for the ongoing will contest. I was legally compelled to sit in a room and answer my father's attorneys under oath. I arrived at a neutral law office in downtown Bangor, my damp winter coat smelling faintly of the harbor. The conference room was a sterile expanse of polished mahogany and frosted glass designed to strip away emotion and focus entirely on cold, legal facts. Elias sat beside me, arranging his files with a calm, pragmatic demeanor. Across the table sat my father. Thomas wore a sharp navy suit, projecting a flawless mask of concerned paternal grief. Beside him sat his lead litigator, a man named Harrison, who possessed the aggressive, predatory energy of a cornered shark. Harrison did not ease into the interrogation. He launched a rapid-fire barrage of questions designed to corner me and dismantle my credibility. He paced the length of the conference table, his voice rising in volume, attempting to rattle my exhausted nervous system. He asked me to detail the exact frequency of my visits to my grandmother during her final 6 months. He demanded I recount specific conversations, attempting to twist my words into a narrative of manipulation. He painted a fabricated picture for the court reporter, suggesting I isolated a frail, dementia-riddled woman feeding her lies about her own son in order to secure a multi-million-dollar coastal estate. I tried to follow Elias's earlier instructions to remain stoic and answer only the direct questions. I tried to breathe through the rising panic, but the severe sleep deprivation, the grueling physical labor, and the suffocating pressure of the impending bank foreclosure stripped away my emotional armor. Harrison leaned over the table, resting his palms on the polished wood. He looked down at me, his eyes narrowing with calculated contempt. He asked me if I honestly believed an 18-year-old college freshman possessed the business acumen to manage a historic property. He scoffed, questioning how I could justify stealing a legacy from a man who spent decades building a prominent commercial distribution empire. The insulting, arrogant dismissal triggered a sudden visceral shift in my reality. The sterile walls of the Bangor law office faded away. I was suddenly 14 years old again, standing on the steep, slanted roof of the Harbor View Inn. The bitter December wind whipped off the Atlantic, howling through the ancient pine trees. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, threatening a heavy snowfall. I was shivering, holding a bucket of rusty nails, while my grandmother knelt on the icy shingles. Ruth wore a faded canvas jacket, her calloused hands expertly hammering fresh cedar patches over a leak in the roof. She did not complain about the cold. She worked with a fierce, relentless determination, teaching me how to find the structural weak points and secure the wooden shingles against the brutal coastal storms. I looked down through the skylight window into the warm, heated living room of the inn. My father sat on a plush leather sofa, safe from the freezing wind. Thomas held a sleek new cell phone to his ear, laughing loudly and drinking a glass of expensive bourbon. I remembered climbing down the wooden ladder later that afternoon, my hands numb and bleeding. I remembered walking into the living room and hearing my father mock my grandmother. He told Ruth she was wasting her time patching a crumbling relic. He sneered, calling the historic inn a pathetic hobby and insisting it was not a real business compared to his corporate lobster distribution company. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. Ruth had chosen me because I was the only person in the family willing to climb onto the freezing roof and do the actual exhausting work required to keep the legacy alive. Thomas viewed the inn as a disposable asset, a piece of coastal dirt waiting to be paved over for profit. The stark, infuriating contrast between my grandmother's rugged dedication and my father's corporate vanity ignited a blinding, ferocious rage in my chest. The sterile conference room rushed back into focus. Harrison was still leaning over the table, demanding an answer, demanding I confess to manipulating a senile old woman. I did not remain cool and collected. I did not deliver a sharp, calculated legal defense. The emotional messiness peaked in a raw, explosive outburst. I slammed my closed fist against the mahogany table. The loud crack echoed through the silent room, causing the court reporter to jump in her seat. I stood up, knocking my heavy leather chair backward. I screamed at the predatory lawyer. My voice cracked, tearing from my throat in a jagged, unpolished roar. I yelled that my grandmother did not suffer from dementia. I shouted that she possessed more mental clarity and physical grit on her deathbed than my father exhibited in his entire pathetic life. Tears streamed down my face, hot and humiliating. I pointed a shaking finger directly at Thomas. I shattered the stoic decorum of the deposition, laying bare the ugly, undeniable truth of his neglect. I screamed that my parents never even visited Ruth during her final 6 months. I yelled that while I was sitting by her hospital bed, holding her frail hand and helping her sip water, Thomas was actively meeting with out-of-state luxury developers, plotting how quickly he could bulldoze her home the moment her heart stopped beating. I sobbed, accusing my father of treating his own mother's death like a lucrative real estate transaction. I stood there panting, my chest heaving, feeling exposed, and entirely unraveled. The polished mask of the corporate litigation shattered under the weight of my raw, jagged grief. Thomas stared at me, his face pale, his jaw clenched in a tight, rigid line. He did not offer a defense. He simply watched his daughter fall apart on the official legal record. Harrison stood up straight, a triumphant, predatory gleam flashing in his eyes. He turned to the court reporter, instructing her to ensure my aggressive, unstable outburst was documented precisely in the transcript. The lawyer knew my messy, emotional explosion played perfectly into their narrative. He intended to use my furious tears to prove I was an erratic, volatile teenager fully capable of erratic, volatile manipulation. Elias Thorne slammed his own hand on the table, cutting off the opposing counsel. The seasoned attorney did not yell. He spoke with a dark, commanding authority demanding an immediate 20-minute recess. He grabbed my arm, his grip firm and unyielding, pulling me out of the conference room before I could inflict any more damage to my own case. Elias marched me down the hallway and shoved me into a small, empty break room, shutting the heavy door behind us. The sudden quiet of the small room felt suffocating. I leaned against the counter, covering my face with my trembling hands. The fierce adrenaline that fueled my screaming match evaporated, leaving me hollow and deeply ashamed. I realized the catastrophic mistake I had just made. By losing my temper and succumbing to the raw agony of my grief, I had handed Harrison the exact ammunition he needed to assassinate my character in front of a judge. Elias did not offer comforting platitudes. He did not tell me everything was going to be all right. He poured a cup of lukewarm water from a plastic pitcher and shoved it into my hands. The attorney looked at me with a harsh, unblinking pragmatism. He told me the courtroom does not care about emotional truth. He said the law only respects cold, documented evidence. He warned me that if I allowed my father to trigger my rage, I would lose the historic inn, the Deepwater acreage, and my grandmother's legacy before the trial even began. I stood in the break room sipping the stale water, reckoning with my own lack of emotional control. I realized the grueling night shifts and the severe sleep deprivation were stripping away my cognitive defenses, making me dangerously vulnerable to their psychological attacks. The urge to accept the $50,000 settlement and surrender the fight returned with terrifying force. I was a broke, exhausted 18-year-old girl fighting a seasoned corporate machine, and I was currently losing the war. I stared at the blank wall, knowing I had to find a way to lock down my emotions and secure absolute undeniable proof of my grandmother's lucidity before the recess ended and the legal execution resumed. The devastating deposition left me feeling entirely hollowed out. I survived the remaining hour of the interrogation by biting the inside of my cheek until it bled, keeping my answers to a single agonizing syllable. When the session finally concluded, I did not return to the grueling, freezing packing line at the harbor. I followed Elias Thorne back to his quiet, wood-paneled office in downtown Bangor. The impending 48-hour deadline to accept my father's settlement offer hung over me like a dark, suffocating cloud. The $50,000 cash stipend and the promise of a warm dormitory felt less like a bribe and more like a necessary surrender. My messy emotional outburst had given Thomas the exact leverage he needed to destroy my character in court. I sat in the leather chair across from my attorney, staring blankly at the polished mahogany desk, genuinely ready to throw in the towel and let the luxury developers bulldoze my grandmother's legacy. Elias watched the defeat settle into my posture. He did not offer a motivational speech. He did not reprimand me for my failure in the conference room. He stood up from his desk, walked over to a heavy iron safe in the corner of his office, and dialed the combination. The heavy metal door swung open with a dull click. The attorney reached inside and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He walked back to the desk and untied the thick black drawstrings. He reached inside and produced the heavy antique brass compass he had mentioned during our very first phone call while I sat locked in the freezing Subaru. Elias slid the compass across the polished wood. The brass was tarnished a dull, muted green, and the thick glass cover bore the familiar long, thin scratch across the center. He pushed it toward me until the cold metal bumped gently against my folded hands. He told me I was looking at the problem like a panicked child trapped in a storm. He said I was letting my father dictate the direction of the wind. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He repeated the exact message my grandmother left for me. He said Ruth did not hand me a sentimental trinket to gather dust on a shelf. She gave me an instrument of navigation because she knew I would eventually lose my bearings in the dark. I picked up the compass. The metal was heavy and cold against my skin. I remembered sitting on the wraparound porch of the historic inn as a young girl spinning the dial and watching the magnetic needle search for true north. I looked down at the tarnished brass, feeling a profound, heavy wave of grief wash over me. The sentimental value of the object offered no practical solution to the impending bank foreclosure or the aggressive will contest. I needed hard, admissible legal evidence, not a nautical metaphor. I told Elias the compass could not pay my university tuition or stop a judge from believing my father's lies. I set the heavy instrument back down on the desk, my voice cracking with bitter, exhausted defeat. Elias did not argue. He simply reached across the desk and tapped his thick index finger against the bottom casing of the compass. He told me to stop looking at the glass and start looking at the foundation. He urged me to examine the object closer. I picked the compass back up, frowning in confusion. I turned the heavy brass casing over in my hands. I ran my thumb along the smooth, polished bottom plate. I pressed slightly harder and felt a tiny millimeter of give. The solid brass plate shifted. I examined the outer edge and noticed a microscopic hairline fracture running along the circular seam. The compass was not just a symbolic heirloom. I gripped the heavy casing in my left hand and pressed the palm of my right hand flat against the bottom plate. I twisted hard, applying a sudden sharp pressure. The brass groaned, emitting a faint metallic squeak. The bottom plate rotated counterclockwise, unscrewing from the main housing of the instrument. I pulled the circular plate away, revealing a shallow, hollowed-out cavity hidden beneath the magnetic dial. Nestled inside the dark recess lay a small, flat object wrapped in a thin layer of wax paper. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled the wax paper out and carefully unfolded it. A small silver key dropped onto the mahogany desk, landing with a sharp, definitive clink. The metal was stamped with a distinct 4-digit number and the faded logo of a prominent regional bank located in Bar Harbor. This was the payoff of the Chekhov's gun introduced in the freezing car on the day of the funeral. Ruth did not leave me a metaphor. She left me a map. She possessed a terrifying strategic clarity regarding her own son. My grandmother knew Thomas would attack my character, accuse her of dementia, and attempt to bulldoze the inn the moment her heart stopped beating. She prepared a hidden vault of ammunition, knowing I would eventually need undeniable proof to survive the legal war. Elias stared at the silver key, a slow, grim smile spreading across his weathered face. He did not waste time with celebratory speeches. The seasoned attorney grabbed his heavy tweed jacket from the coat rack and ordered me to follow him. We rushed out of the law office, the looming threat of the settlement deadline injecting a fierce adrenaline into my exhausted veins. We drove the 60 miles back to Bar Harbor, navigating the icy coastal highways in near silence. The freezing wind battered the windshield, but the physical cold no longer registered. We parked outside the regional bank branch just 20 minutes before closing time. Elias presented his legal credentials as the executor of the estate, granting us immediate access to the high-security vault in the basement of the building. The bank manager escorted us into a small private viewing room and handed me a long rectangular metal lockbox corresponding to the 4-digit number stamped on my grandmother's hidden key. The heavy steel door clicked shut, leaving Elias and me alone in the windowless room. I slid the silver key into the lockbox and turned it. The mechanism released with a heavy metallic clunk. I opened the lid. The box did not contain stacks of cash or antique jewelry. It held the exact arsenal I needed to execute a flawless legal slaughter. Sitting on top of the pile was a thick, leather-bound ledger book. I recognized the worn cover immediately. It was the same ledger Ruth used to balance the accounts on the porch of the historic inn. I opened the heavy cover and flipped through the pages. The columns were filled with neat, precise handwriting detailing decades of financial transactions. But the final 20 pages were not dedicated to maritime supply costs or guest reservations. The final pages functioned as a meticulous, lucid, and devastatingly detailed diary, documenting every single time Thomas attempted to manipulate, steal, or lie to her over the last 5 years. Ruth recorded specific dates, times, and verbatim conversations. She documented his aggressive attempts to force her into a nursing home, his desperate requests for cash to float his failing distribution company, and his repeated threats to sell her beloved coastal acreage to out-of-state developers. The ledger provided an unbroken timeline of his emotional abuse, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Ruth understood exactly who her son was and what he intended to do. I dug deeper into the lockbox, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Beneath the heavy ledger lay a small plastic sealed bag containing a standard black USB flash drive and a stack of crisp, notarized documents. I pulled the documents out and scanned the first page. It was a formal psychiatric evaluation conducted by an independent, out-of-state medical professional entirely unconnected to the local Bar Harbor healthcare system. The evaluation was dated just 3 weeks prior to her death. The medical report explicitly confirmed that Ruth Jackson possessed total cognitive clarity, complete mental capacity, and absolutely zero symptoms of dementia or age-related decline. The final piece of evidence was the USB drive. Elias plugged it into his secure laptop, booting up the video files. A high-resolution video recording flickered onto the screen. It was filmed inside a neutral legal office. Ruth sat in a comfortable chair looking frail but fiercely alert. A secondary independent notary public sat beside her, clearly identifying the date and time for the official record. My grandmother looked directly into the camera lens. Her voice was weak, raspy from her failing lungs, but her words were sharp, calculated, and devastatingly precise. She stated her full legal name. She explicitly stated her intent to bypass her son Thomas and her granddaughter Clara in the execution of her will. She calmly and methodically explained her reasoning, citing Thomas's predatory business practices and his clear intention to destroy the historic inn for personal corporate gain. She looked into the camera and declared that she was leaving the entirety of the coastal estate to 18-year-old Aria Jackson, because Aria was the only member of the family who possessed the rugged integrity required to preserve the history of the Maine coastline. I stared at the laptop screen, tears streaming down my face. It was not a tear of exhausted panic. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming vindication. My grandmother reached across the grave and handed me an impenetrable shield. The medical evaluations, the meticulous diary, and the time-stamped video recordings proved she was entirely lucid and operating under her own independent free will. The evidence effectively annihilated Thomas's claims of dementia and undue influence. His aggressive will contest was officially dead in the water. I looked at Elias. The attorney slowly closed the laptop, a look of deep professional satisfaction settling over his features. The $50,000 settlement trap my father offered in the freezing parking lot was no longer a temptation. It was an insult. I possessed the undeniable proof required to crush his legal assault in a court of law. I gathered the ledger, the documents, and the flash drive, placing them carefully back into my canvas tote bag, knowing the upcoming probate trial was no longer a battle for survival, but a venue for an absolute, unquestionable slaughter. 8 months. 240 days of hauling frozen herring under the harsh fluorescent lights of the packing plant. 240 nights of sleeping in a drafty rented room where the radiator barely functioned. The bitter coastal winter eventually thawed into a humid, stifling Maine summer, but the chill in my bones remained. I arrived at the Penobscot County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in late July, wearing a cheap, thrifted blazer that hung loosely on my exhausted frame. The heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom opened to reveal the culmination of my grueling endurance. Thomas sat at the plaintiff's table, exuding an aura of polished corporate triumph. He wore a lightweight tailored suit, his hair perfectly groomed, whispering confidently to his lead litigator. Harrison sat beside my father, arranging his leather portfolios with a smug, predatory certainty. They looked at my pale face and my frayed canvas tote bag, assuming the agonizing months of poverty had broken my spirit. They believed I was walking into the chamber to officially surrender my grandmother's legacy. They had no idea Elias Thorne and I were carrying a loaded weapon hidden inside a battered leather ledger. The probate judge called the session to order, his weary eyes scanning the gallery. Harrison wasted no time launching his offensive. He called his primary witness to the stand. It was a hired medical expert, an out-of-state physician who specialized in geriatric cognitive decline. The doctor possessed a smooth, practiced delivery, reeling off dense medical jargon to confuse the court. He testified that based on his review of scattered clinical charts, Ruth suffered from severe advanced dementia during her final year. Harrison guided the witness through a fabricated narrative. The lawyer painted a pathetic, humiliating picture of my grandmother. He described her as a confused, fragile woman who could not remember her own name, let alone navigate complex estate planning. Thomas bowed his head, pressing a crisp white handkerchief to his eyes, performing the role of the heartbroken son forced to protect his senile mother from a greedy, manipulative teenager. The performance was flawless. Elias stood up from our table. The seasoned estate attorney did not bother cross-examining the hired doctor on the intricacies of neurological decline. He simply approached the bench and handed the judge a sealed manila folder. Elias introduced the independent psychiatric evaluation conducted just 3 weeks before Ruth passed away. He noted that the examining doctor was a highly respected local specialist, entirely unaffiliated with Thomas or his corporate payroll. The judge reviewed the document, his brow furrowing as he read the definitive, unyielding conclusion that Ruth possessed total mental clarity. Harrison jumped out of his chair, shouting a frantic objection, attempting to block the admission of the medical report. But Elias was already signaling the court bailiff. A tall metal cart holding a large television monitor was rolled into the center of the wood-paneled room. Elias handed a small black flash drive to the clerk. He announced he was submitting a time-stamped video recording authenticated by an independent notary public. The screen flickered to life. My grandmother's face appeared illuminating the quiet courtroom. Her voice filled the chamber, raspy from her failing lungs, but sharp as broken glass. She looked directly into the camera lens and systematically dismantled her son's entire fabricated reality. She named Thomas a predator. She detailed his relentless greed, his obsession with corporate vanity, and his explicit intentions to bulldoze the historic inn for a quick profit. She declared with terrifying lucid precision that she was leaving her entire estate to me. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted with whiplash speed. The smug confidence evaporated from Harrison's face. He sank back into his leather chair, realizing his entire case was built on a perjury trap. Thomas dropped his white handkerchief. The feigned grief vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The judge glared down at the plaintiff's table, his expression twisting into deep, unmistakable disgust. But Elias was not finished. The video secured my inheritance and destroyed the will contest, but the attorney intended to scorch the earth. He reached into his briefcase and produced the battered leather ledger we retrieved from the safety deposit box. He walked back to the podium, opening the heavy cover to a specific bookmarked page. Elias directed the court's attention to an event that occurred 3 years prior. He reminded the judge that Ruth had suffered a severe fall, fracturing her hip and requiring a lengthy hospitalization. During that specific 2-week window, my grandmother was heavily sedated, recovering under the influence of powerful intravenous painkillers. Elias read the handwritten entry Ruth penned months later upon discovering a horrifying discrepancy in her financial statements. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Ruth never co-signed the $150,000 equity line of credit. She never authorized the bank to place a lien against the historic inn. Thomas forged her signature on the loan documents while she drifted in and out of consciousness in her hospital bed. The staggering plot twist rewired the entire narrative. The crippling debt threatening to foreclose on the coastal property was not a bad business deal my grandmother made in her declining years. It was a calculated, ruthless theft. Thomas did not just lie to his family. He lied to a regional financial institution. He committed federal bank fraud. The color drained entirely from my father's face. The realization that he was no longer fighting a civil probate battle but facing imminent felony charges and a lengthy prison sentence paralyzed him. He stared at Elias, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His own lawyer physically distanced himself, sliding his chair inches away from his client, eager to escape the radioactive blast radius of a federal crime. The judge did not hesitate. He slammed his wooden gavel down with a resounding crack. He threw out the will contest with extreme prejudice, citing overwhelming evidence of fraud and perjury on the part of the plaintiff. He formally and officially granted the entirety of the estate to me. I was the sole undisputed owner of the Harbor View Inn and the surrounding pristine coastal acreage. I sat in my chair, exhaling a shaky, ragged breath. The grueling 8-month war was over. I had survived the freezing night shifts, the public humiliation, and the brutal isolation. I expected to feel a soaring, victorious vindication. Instead, Elias leaned over and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. He packed his briefcase, his face grim and unsmiling. He pulled me into the quiet hallway outside the courtroom, delivering a crushing reality check. The legal victory was undeniable, but the immediate financial reality was a hollow, devastating shell. The attorney explained the unforgiving nature of the banking system. The regional bank held a signed contract attached to the property deed. Proving the signature was forged and untangling a federal fraud case would take years of slow, agonizing civil litigation. The bank did not care about my father's impending criminal charges. They only cared about the delinquent account. The judicial hold on the estate was lifted, which meant the foreclosure clock resumed its countdown. Elias looked me in the eye and delivered the terrifying timeline. I possessed the legal title to a multi-million-dollar coastal estate, but the bank still demanded the $150,000 to cure the default. I had exactly 14 days to hand a certified check to the loan officer. If I missed the deadline by a single minute, the bank would seize the property, auction it to the highest bidder, and erase my grandmother's legacy forever. I had won the war against my father, only to find myself standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down a ticking clock with empty pockets. The drive back from the Bangor courthouse felt heavier than the frozen morning I spent locked inside the Subaru. The victory I secured in front of the judge provided legal vindication, but the crushing reality of the impending foreclosure eclipsed any sense of triumph. I owned a sprawling historic coastal estate, and I was simultaneously 14 days away from losing it entirely. I parked my car in the gravel lot outside the fish packing plant. The summer heat caused the lingering stench of industrial brine to rise off the pavement, suffocating the humid afternoon air. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, exhaustion pulling at my bones. The grueling 8 months of nocturnal labor had depleted my physical reserves. I needed sleep. I needed a hot meal. But more than anything, I needed $150,000. As I stared at the corrugated metal exterior of the packing plant, my mind drifted back to the bitter December evening when my parents ambushed me in this exact parking lot. I remembered Thomas stepping out of his heated luxury SUV, his tailored coat pulled tight against the freezing wind. I remembered the pristine white envelope he held out toward me, offering a $50,000 cash stipend to cover my tuition and save me from the brutal night shifts. He told me the money was a generous peace offering designed to ensure my comfort. He promised the cash would secure my future. All I had to do was sign a quitclaim deed surrendering my rights to the Harborview Inn. I sat in my sweltering car, the air conditioner rattling weakly, and finally understood the true malicious anatomy of that settlement offer. The revelation hit me with sickening clarity. Thomas never possessed the $50,000. The generous cash stipend was an illusion, a phantom sum dangled in front of a starving teenager to force a hasty surrender. My father was drowning in commercial debt, facing the impending collapse of his lobster distribution company. The bank was threatening to seize the historic inn due to the massive forged equity line of credit. Thomas orchestrated a desperate, frantic scheme to save his own skin. He had already promised the pristine deep-water acreage to the out-of-state luxury developers. The developers were eager to bulldoze my grandmother's legacy and construct high-end waterfront condominiums, but they required a clean, unencumbered property deed to break ground. Thomas needed my signature on that quitclaim deed to finalize the transaction. If I had succumbed to the exhaustion, if I had reached out and taken that white envelope, my signature would have triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. Thomas intended to instantly flip the coastal property to the developers the moment the ink dried on the contract. He planned to use the massive corporate down payment to pay off the forged bank liens, satisfy his mounting business debts, and hand me my pathetic $50,000 bribe. He was going to use the very destruction of the inn to finance my payoff. If I had surrendered the fight out of sheer physical fatigue, the Harborview Inn would have been reduced to splintered wood and rubble the very next morning. The ancient pine forests would have been clear-cut. The rugged, authentic history of the coastline would have been paved over with sterile concrete and my grandmother's memory erased forever. A cold, hardened fury began to replace the hollow exhaustion in my chest. The near miss was terrifying. I realized how incredibly close I came to betraying Ruth's trust, simply because my muscles ached and I was desperate for a warm bed. The malicious psychological trap my father laid out demonstrated exactly how little he valued my existence. He weaponized my poverty and exploited my vulnerable state to orchestrate a lucrative real estate scam. He treated my suffering as a convenient negotiation tactic. The anger crystallized into an unbreakable, fierce resolve. I refused to let his calculated cruelty succeed. I refused to let the luxury developers win. I sat up straight, gripping the steering wheel. I was no longer a frightened, grieving teenager hiding in the shadows waiting for a rescue. I was a survivor who navigated an agonizing legal war and beat a seasoned corporate machine in a courtroom. I possessed the rugged, relentless grit of a true Maine local. I pulled my car out of the industrial parking lot, ignoring the impending start of my packing shift. Hauling frozen herring would not generate the capital I needed to save the estate. I needed to shift my strategy entirely. I drove toward the university campus, my mind racing through complex financial calculations. Elias Thorne had made it abundantly clear that traditional commercial avenues were closed. A regional bank would never issue a massive six-figure loan to an 18-year-old college sophomore with zero established credit history and no independent income stream. The standard financial doors were firmly locked. I could not rely on the conventional corporate system because the conventional system was built to cater to men like my father. I needed to leverage the only asset I truly understood. I needed to leverage the academic environment that initially offered me a lifeline when my family abandoned me. I thought about Professor Miller, the rugged marine biologist who granted me the crucial 48-hour extension during the darkest week of the winter. He did not coddle me with sentimental sympathy. He offered me a pragmatic opportunity to prove my worth through rigorous research. The coastal ecology proposal I drafted during those sleepless nights outlined the devastating environmental impact of unchecked commercial development on the fragile Maine shoreline. The academic paper detailed the critical importance of preserving pristine deepwater habitats for long-term ecological sustainability. The historic inn sat on 60 acres of untouched, rugged coastline, encompassing tidal pools, dense pine forests, and immediate access to the open Atlantic Ocean. It was a perfect natural laboratory. It was exactly the kind of pristine environment the University Ecology Department coveted for field research and long-term environmental studies. I parked my Subaru outside the science building, grabbing my faded canvas tote bag. The suffocating anxiety of the 14-day deadline remained, but the paralyzing despair was gone. I walked up the concrete steps, my boots clicking with a renewed urgent rhythm. I was not walking into a trap set by my father. I was walking into a negotiation room of my own design. I needed to convince a hardened, cynical academic bureaucracy to invest a massive sum of liquid capital into my vision before the bank auctioned off the only home I had left. The biology department offices were located on the third floor of an aging brick building that smelled of formaldehyde and stale coffee. I hurried down the narrow corridor, clutching a thick binder containing the revised version of my coastal ecology midterm. It was the exact proposal I had drafted in my freezing rented room over 6 months ago during the darkest week of my life. I knocked on the heavy wooden door of Professor Miller's office, not waiting for a formal invitation before pushing it open. Professor Miller sat behind a chaotic desk piled high with academic journals and saltwater samples. He looked up, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, surprised by the sudden intrusion. He possessed the gruff, unpolished demeanor of a man who preferred studying tidal patterns to dealing with university politics. I did not offer a polite apology for the interruption. I stepped up to his desk, dropping the thick binder onto the clutter. I laid out the desperate reality of my situation with clinical precision. I explained the staggering legal victory in the Bangor courthouse, the forged bank loan, and the impending 14-day foreclosure deadline. I told him I legally owned 60 acres of pristine, untouched deep-water Maine coastline, but I was about to lose it all to a regional bank and a group of predatory luxury developers. Professor Miller leaned back in his chair, his weathered face hardening into a serious, analytical expression. He understood the devastating environmental cost of losing that specific stretch of shoreline. The luxury condominiums my father planned to facilitate would inevitably destroy the delicate coastal ecosystem, ruining decades of natural preservation. I opened the binder, pointing to the specific ecological data points I had mapped out in my research proposal. I pitched my vision not as a desperate plea for charity, but as a highly lucrative academic opportunity. I proposed transforming the sprawling historic Harbor View Inn into a premier on-site marine research and ecotourism retreat. I offered the university exclusive access to the deep water shoreline for long-term ecological studies, field research, and conservation training. I told him I needed $150,000 in liquid capital immediately. The professor let out a low, sharp whistle. He rubbed his bearded chin, digesting the sheer magnitude of the financial request. He did not dismiss the idea outright, but he pragmatically outlined the bureaucratic obstacle standing in my way. He explained that university budget approvals move at a glacial pace. Securing a massive six-figure grant through the standard administrative channels required multiple faculty committee votes, risk assessments, and a minimum processing window of 6 to 8 months. The state university system was incapable of moving fast enough to beat my 14-day foreclosure deadline. A cold, heavy weight settled into my chest. The brilliant academic strategy I devised was collapsing under the weight of red tape. The bank was not going to delay the auction to accommodate a university budget cycle. But Professor Miller did not hand me the binder back. He kept his hands resting on the open pages, his eyes scanning the detailed environmental mapping I had meticulously compiled. He told me the public university system was useless in an emergency, but the private sector operated under a completely different set of rules. He leaned forward, picking up his desk phone. He mentioned a wealthy private alumni conservation fund composed of retired marine biologists and rugged coastal conservationists. They were fiercely protective of the Maine shoreline and possessed the autonomous financial resources to act swiftly without waiting for bureaucratic approval. The professor dialed a number, scheduling an emergency meeting for the following morning. The next 48 hours were a grueling masterclass in high-stakes negotiation. Elias Thorne drove down from Bangor, acting as my legal counsel, while I spearheaded the pitch. We sat in a sleek, modern boardroom facing a panel of 5 skeptical, wealthy alumni directors. They were pragmatic, shrewd individuals who demanded absolute structural guarantees before parting with a single dollar of their conservation endowment. I did not attempt to sell them a sentimental story about saving my grandmother's legacy. I relied entirely on the academic brilliance seeded during those freezing nights at the packing plant. I presented the detailed ecological research displaying the unparalleled access the coastal inn provided to the vital tidal ecosystems. I argued that acquiring a similar coastal property on the open market would cost the foundation millions of dollars. I was offering them a massive, heavily discounted opportunity to secure a permanent research foothold on the Atlantic coast. The negotiations were brutal. The alumni directors scrutinized every single clause of the proposed agreement, questioning my age, my lack of business experience, and the structural integrity of the aging inn. Elias parried their legal concerns, confirming the absolute validity of the deed, and providing the authenticated engineering reports Ruth had commissioned years prior. I held my ground, refusing to shrink under the intense interrogation. I channeled the unyielding grit of my grandmother, matching their skepticism with hard, undeniable data. On the 3rd afternoon of intense deliberations, the alumni fund director finally slid a formal contract across the mahogany table. The financial rescue was not a magical, unconditional gift. It was a grounded, realistic, and highly structured commercial partnership. The foundation agreed to issue a private historic preservation grant totaling exactly $150,000. The funds would be wired directly to the regional bank, satisfying the forged equity line of credit and officially terminating the foreclosure threat. The immediate influx of cash secured my property, but it required a significant long-term concession. In exchange for the immediate capital, I legally granted the Alumni Conservation Fund a strict 10-year ecological research easement on the 60 acres of coastal land. The easement permanently prohibited any future commercial real estate development, including the construction of luxury condominiums or private marinas. The foundation secured exclusive rights to utilize the shoreline for academic research, transforming the property into a protected ecological sanctuary. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the final page of the contract. The ink bled into the thick paper locking in the agreement. I did not feel a sense of loss over granting the easement. The legal restriction aligned perfectly with my vision. It guaranteed that the rugged, authentic history of the coastline would remain untouched, honoring Ruth's memory, while simultaneously obliterating my father's destructive corporate ambitions. Elias gathered the signed documents, placing them carefully into his leather briefcase. The attorney looked at me, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his weathered face. He told me he was driving straight to the regional bank to deliver the certified check and legally clear the title. I walked out of the boardroom, the heavy, suffocating weight of the foreclosure deadline finally lifting off my shoulders. I had navigated the treacherous legal maze, survived the freezing physical labor, and outmaneuvered the relentless financial strangulation my father orchestrated. I possessed the clean, unencumbered deed to a multi-million-dollar coastal estate. The war was officially won. I stepped out into the crisp Maine air, taking a deep lungful of the salty coastal breeze, preparing to face the final inevitable collision with the man who tried to orchestrate my ruin. The certified check Elias Thorne delivered to the regional bank cleared the following morning. The heavy, suffocating threat of foreclosure evaporated instantly. The legal title to the Harborview Inn and the sprawling 60 acres of deep-water coastline was officially clean unencumbered and registered exclusively under my name. The immediate consequence of my survival was the total catastrophic collapse of my father's secret empire. The 10-year ecological research easement I granted to the Alumni Conservation Fund functioned as a lethal poison pill against any future corporate exploitation. The moment the restrictive covenant was filed with the county clerk's office, the out-of-state luxury developers realized their ambitious project was dead in the water. They could not bulldoze the historic inn. They could not construct high-end waterfront condominiums or pave over the ancient pine forests. The pristine coastal land was permanently legally protected. The developers did not hesitate. They immediately terminated their preliminary purchase agreements, pulling their lucrative corporate down payment off the table. They abandoned Thomas, leaving him entirely exposed to the crushing weight of his own financial recklessness. My father no longer possessed a secret exit strategy to save his failing commercial distribution company. The massive loans he took out to purchase his fleet of refrigerated transport trucks went into default. His business accounts were frozen. Adding to his mounting terror, the regional bank officially initiated a formal investigation into the forged signatures on the original equity line of credit, triggering the looming threat of federal fraud charges. The pristine, stoic image he spent decades cultivating shattered, leaving behind a desperate, terrified man drowning in a sea of debt. The fallout forced a final, humiliating confrontation. It happened on a cold, gray Tuesday afternoon in late February. I was standing on the wraparound porch of the historic inn, sweeping away a thick layer of dead pine needles and salt-crusted debris. The property required massive restorative work before the university researchers could occupy the rooms. But I was finally working on my own land. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I stopped sweeping, resting my hands on the wooden handle of the broom. Thomas and Brenda stepped out of their luxury SUV. The vehicle looked dirty, the pristine black paint splattered with gray winter slush. My parents did not march up the wooden steps with the arrogant, demanding posture they displayed at the fish packing plant 2 months ago. They moved with a slow, heavy hesitation, their shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of their impending ruin. Brenda looked incredibly fragile. The frugal, unyielding Maine stoicism she usually projected was entirely gone. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, indicating days of relentless, frantic crying. She clutched her expensive wool coat tight against her chest, shivering in the biting coastal wind. Thomas stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. He did not attempt to climb the steps, realizing he no longer possessed the authority to enter the property. He looked up at me, the arrogant corporate vanity completely stripped away. He looked like a cornered animal staring at the only person holding a key to the cage. He did not yell. He did not threaten to cut off my tuition. He spoke in a low, cracked whisper, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated desperation. He begged me for a personal loan. The staggering audacity of the request hung in the freezing air. Thomas laid out the bleak reality of his situation. The distribution company was filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by the end of the week. The federal investigators were circling the forged loan documents, threatening a lengthy prison sentence if he could not negotiate a massive financial settlement. Most terrifying of all, the local bank was initiating foreclosure proceedings against his own private residence in Bar Harbor. He and Brenda were weeks away from losing their home and facing total public humiliation. He pleaded with me to leverage the clean equity of the coastal estate to secure a new commercial loan. He asked me to borrow against my grandmother's legacy, to bail him out of the catastrophic mess he created. He swore he would pay me back with interest, promising to rebuild his company and restore the family honor. Brenda stepped forward, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She appealed to my sense of familial duty. She begged me to remember the sacrifices they made during my childhood, attempting to weaponize my empathy one final time. She told me the local community would never forgive me if I allowed my own parents to become homeless on the freezing streets of Maine. I stood on the porch, looking down at the two people who locked me in a freezing Subaru during a funeral. The messy internal conflict that plagued me during the earlier months of the legal war was entirely absent. The pity I felt for my father's financial terror had burned away during the grueling night shifts at the fish packing plant. I remembered the hostile glares at the local diner, the smear campaign that destroyed my reputation, and the malicious settlement trap designed to bulldoze this very inn. They did not view me as a daughter. They viewed me as a disposable asset, a convenient shock absorber for their own toxic failures. I gripped the wooden handle of the broom. I did not deliver a furious, screaming monologue. I did not raise my voice or throw their past abuses back in their faces. I spoke with a quiet, cold, and absolute finality. I told them no. I stated clearly that I would not leverage a single penny of my grandmother's legacy to save them from the consequences of their own greed. I refused to set myself on fire to keep their fabricated corporate image warm. Thomas opened his mouth to argue, to launch another desperate plea, but the flat, unwavering resolve in my eyes silenced him. The realization that he had permanently, irrevocably destroyed his relationship with the only person capable of saving his life finally settled into his bones. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving with a silent, agonizing sob. He turned around, without saying another word, grabbed Brenda's arm and led her back to the dirty SUV. I watched them drive down the long gravel driveway, knowing it was the last time they would ever set foot on this property. The ultimate payoff unfolded over the next 3 months, delivering a staggering dose of poetic justice. Without the massive financial bailout, Thomas was forced into total personal and commercial bankruptcy. The local bank seized his sprawling house in Bar Harbor, forcing my parents to move into a cramped, damp apartment on the undesirable edge of the county. The federal fraud investigation concluded with a grueling plea deal that stripped my father of his remaining dignity and permanently barred him from holding any corporate executive position in the state of Maine. But the most devastating blow arrived during the liquidation of his commercial assets. The bank aggressively repossessed his prized commercial lobster distribution boat. It was a massive, heavy-duty vessel he purchased years ago during the height of his arrogant expansion. He loved that boat, viewing it as the physical manifestation of his dominance over the rugged coastal industry. The bank hauled the vessel to a public commercial auction, aiming to recover a fraction of the outstanding debt. I attended the auction, standing quietly in the back row of the crowded harbor warehouse. I did not look like a broke, exhausted college freshman. I wore a sharp, warm winter coat, projecting the calm, measured confidence of a young woman managing a highly lucrative ecotourism retreat. The private Alumni Conservation Fund had recently issued the first quarterly installment of the 10-year commercial lease agreement. The massive influx of operational revenue sat securely in the estate trust account. When the auctioneer introduced my father's prized lobster boat, I raised my bidding paddle. I did not hesitate. I engaged in a swift, aggressive bidding war against 2 local commercial distributors, outmaneuvering them with cold precision. I utilized the lease revenue generated by the very property my father tried to destroy to purchase the repossessed vessel outright. I secured the winning bid, securing the legal title to the massive commercial boat for a fraction of its original value. The following week, I executed the final devastating phase of the strategy. Thomas was bankrupt, unemployed, and unemployable in the corporate sector due to his fraud conviction. His only remaining marketable skill was his deep working knowledge of the local coastal fishing routes. I hired Elias Thorne to draft a highly specific commercial employment contract. I leased the commercial lobster boat back to my father at a strict, non-negotiable market rate. The man who locked me in a freezing car, who viewed the calloused hands of the local fishermen with arrogant disgust, was legally forced to sign the contract to avoid starvation. I became his landlord, his creditor, and his direct employer. The patriarch who spent his entire life running away from the grueling, unglamorous reality of manual labor was now legally bound to wake up before dawn, haul heavy lobster traps in the freezing Atlantic spray, and hand over a significant percentage of his daily catch to an 18-year-old girl. He was trapped in the exact rugged blue-collar life he spent decades trying to escape working on a vessel legally owned by the daughter he tried to ruin. 1 year passed since the gavel fell in the Penobscot County Courthouse. The bitter coastal winter gave way to a brief, fleeting spring and settled into a crisp, vibrant Maine autumn. The rugged Atlantic Ocean crashed against the jagged granite cliffs, sending plumes of white sea spray into the chilly morning air. The familiar scent of salty brine, mixed with the sharp fragrance of ancient pine trees, no longer triggered memories of grueling midnight shifts at the packing plant. I was 19 years old, navigating my sophomore year at the university with a steady, grounded focus. I was no longer a terrified, sleep-deprived teenager waiting for the next disaster to strike. I was the managing director of a thriving ecological retreat. The Harbor View Inn buzzed with renewed, purposeful energy. Instead of out-of-state luxury developers paving over the pristine deepwater acreage, eager marine biology graduate students occupied the historic guest rooms. They spent their days wading into the tidal pools, collecting water samples, and cataloging the fragile coastal ecosystems. The private alumni grant secured the operational budget, guaranteeing the property remained untouched by commercial greed for the next decade. I walked the wraparound porch, holding a clipboard coordinating research schedules and maintenance requests. The old cedar shingles held strong against the coastal winds, a testament to the rugged endurance my grandmother instilled in the foundation. Later that afternoon, a modest silver sedan crunched along the gravel driveway. I stopped sweeping the wooden floorboards and watched the vehicle park near the edge of the tree line. Clara stepped out into the brisk autumn air. My older sister did not wear the expensive designer coats she favored during our childhood. She wore a simple, faded fleece jacket, her dark hair tied back in a loose knot. The dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted over the past 12 months. She no longer carried the smug, protected aura of the golden child. She moved with a cautious, hesitant grace, bridging a fragile gap between my new reality and the wreckage of our past. Clara walked up the porch steps, carrying a white cardboard bakery box tied with a thin cotton string. She offered a small, tentative smile, placing the box on a weathered wooden table sitting between two rocking chairs. She opened the lid, revealing a deep dish Maine blueberry pie. The sweet, tart aroma of the baked fruit filled the crisp air, an unspoken olive branch rooted in familiar local traditions. I set my broom aside and sat in one of the rocking chairs, accepting the slice she handed me on a paper plate. We ate in a quiet, measured silence, listening to the distant cry of the seagulls circling the harbor. Eventually, Clara shared the grim details of our parents' current existence. The sprawling luxury they once flaunted was entirely erased. Thomas and Brenda now rented a cramped, drafty two-bedroom apartment situated above a noisy commercial laundromat on the bleak industrial edge of Bangor. Brenda spent her days clipping grocery coupons to afford basic necessities, mourning the country club social circle that abandoned her the moment the bankruptcy became public. They lived in a perpetual state of quiet, bitter humiliation, entirely isolated from the wealthy coastal elite they spent decades trying to impress. I listened to the update without feeling a single tremor of guilt or pity. The emotional chains that once bound me to their approval were permanently severed. I felt only a cold, clinical acceptance of their self-inflicted ruin. But the true, visceral weight of my father's punishment unfolded miles away from that cramped apartment, out on the unforgiving open water. Every morning, long before the sun crested the horizon, Thomas woke up in the freezing darkness. He drove to the commercial docks, pulling on heavy, stiff rubber overalls and thick waterproof boots. He stepped onto the deck of a commercial lobster boat, preparing for a grueling 14-hour shift. The man who locked me in a freezing car to protect his pristine corporate vanity was now forced to endure the biting Atlantic wind whipping across his exposed face. His hands, once soft and manicured, were now cracked, calloused, and stained with diesel fuel and bait. He spent his days hauling heavy wire traps over the gunnel muscles, aching lungs burning, pulling the catch from the icy depths. He performed this back-breaking manual labor on a vessel legally owned by his teenage daughter. I utilized the early revenue from the eco-retreat lease to purchase his repossessed boat at auction, leasing it back to him at a strict market rate. The legal arrangement mandated that a significant percentage of his daily catch went directly into an operating trust account I controlled. He was trapped in an endless loop of grueling physical debt, working as a blue-collar deckhand to enrich the exact person he tried to leave homeless. To seal the poetic justice of his daily reality, I hired a local painter to change the name on the stern of the vessel. Before Thomas stepped onto the deck for his first shift, the painter brushed a new title across the fiberglass hull in bold, stark white lettering. I renamed the boat Ruth's Compass. Every single morning when my father stepped over the gunwale, he was forced to look at the name of the mother he betrayed and the instrument of navigation that guided his daughter to victory. He could never escape the physical reminder of his own catastrophic arrogance. Clara finished her slice of pie, brushing the crumbs from her lap. She did not ask me to forgive them. She understood the boundaries I erected were forged in iron and non-negotiable. She hugged me briefly, a cautious, awkward embrace, before walking back to her car. I watched her drive away, feeling a quiet gratitude for the fragile connection we were slowly rebuilding, separate from the toxic shadow of our parents. I remained on the porch as the late afternoon sun dipped below the jagged tree line, painting the coastal sky in brilliant shades of bruised purple and burning orange. The taste of the sweet blueberries lingered on my tongue, a sharp contrast to the bitter coffee Elias served me months ago. I leaned back in the rocking chair, pulling a thick knitted blanket over my shoulders. The gathering twilight brought a creeping coastal fog rolling in off the Atlantic. I looked out across the dark expanse of the churning water. In the far distance, situated on a treacherous rocky outcrop, a lighthouse cut a brilliant sweeping beam through the thick gray mist. The structure stood entirely alone, battered by endless storms facing the full wrath of the ocean, without ever breaking. I stared at the piercing light guiding unseen ships through the dangerous shoals. I realized the profound parallel to my own journey. I had lost the comforting illusion of a warm nuclear family. The parents who were supposed to protect me turned out to be the very storm I had to survive. But sitting on the sturdy wooden planks of my grandmother's inn, I knew I gained something infinitely more valuable. I forged an unbreakable self-sufficient spirit. The heavy brass compass guided me through the darkest freezing nights of my life, and now I was the one tending the light, standing firm on the rugged shoreline, holding my ground against the tide. We live in an era where the American dream has for many fractured into a desperate race for optical perfection. We measure the success of a household by the zip code, the polished holiday cards, the curated digital updates, and the prestigious college decals adhered to the back windows of expensive vehicles. But beneath this glossy veneer, a quiet spiritual decay often takes root in the very heart of the traditional family. Consider the story of 18-year-old Aria locked inside a freezing Subaru during a bitter Maine nor'easter, while her father prioritized the handshakes of wealthy investors over the tears of his grieving daughter. As a spiritual practitioner observing the modern family dynamic, I see Aria's journey not merely as a dramatic tale of stolen inheritance or courtroom battles. It is a profound modern parable. It holds up a mirror to the destructive nature of ego, the heavy cost of misguided love, and the quiet tragedies that unfold when parents lose their moral bearings. Thomas and Brenda did not wake up one morning and decide to become villains. They were slowly consumed by a pervasive societal illness, a culture that relentlessly equates human worth with financial leverage and public perception. The most chilling moment of their story lies in the parking lot of that coastal church. Thomas banished his daughter to the freezing cold because her raw, authentic mourning threatened to embarrass his corporate facade. In today's demanding world, parents face an immense unnatural pressure to project a flawless image. Spiritually, we call this the idolatry of the ego. When a mother or father prioritizes how their family appears to the outside world over how their child feels on the inside, they sever the most sacred bond of trust. We must learn to dismantle these fragile egos. A child's messy, complicated humanity is never a liability. It is a gift. A home must be cultivated as a sanctuary where emotional truth is valued far above the fleeting applause of strangers. This brings us to the sacredness of emotion itself. Thomas equated stoicism with strength, viewing his daughter's tears as a weakness to be hidden away. This is a dangerous, pervasive fallacy within traditional family structures. True resilience does not mean suppressing pain. It requires the courage to feel deeply and continue putting one foot in front of the other. When parents punish their children for expressing sadness, fear, or vulnerability, they do not forge strong adults. They forge emotionally fractured individuals who will eventually either explode under the pressure or shut down entirely, building impenetrable walls around their hearts. Parents are meant to be the safe harbor during their children's storms, not the storm itself. We must teach the next generation that to grieve deeply is simply proof that they have loved deeply. Navigating those heavy waters with grace is the highest form of emotional intelligence we can pass down. Yet emotional neglect often walks hand in hand with material greed. Thomas was willing to bulldoze his own mother's historic inn, eager to clear-cut pristine coastal forests, just to erect luxury condos and save his bruised corporate pride. This mirrors a tragic trend in our society, sacrificing long-term soul heritage and integrity for short-term profit. As parents, our responsibility extends beyond providing food and shelter. We are tasked with teaching our children stewardship. We must show them how to care for the world, their local communities, and their history. If we model a life where everything and everyone is merely an asset to be leveraged for cash, we bankrupt our children morally. True wealth is never found behind the tinted windows of a luxury vehicle or in the forced smiles of a high society gala. It is found in the quiet dignity of an honest day's work and the peace of a clear conscience. We see the ultimate culmination of these choices in the undeniable law of cause and effect. The story concludes with a staggering display of poetic justice. Thomas, a man who spent his life running from hard labor and viewing the working class with disdain, is forced to perform grueling manual labor on a commercial boat. He wakes up in the dark, endures the freezing Atlantic spray, and hauls traps on a vessel legally owned by the very daughter he tried to ruin, a boat aptly renamed Ruth's Compass. In spiritual practice, this is the inescapable law of karma. The energy, the actions, and the intentions we pour into the world, especially into our children, will inevitably shape the reality we must eventually inhabit. If you plant seeds of deceit, control, and cruelty, you will harvest a bitter, isolated autumn in the winter of your life. But if you plant seeds of fairness, respect, and unconditional love, you will cultivate a family that stands by your side when the harsh winds blow. Grandmother Ruth understood this law perfectly. She did not leave Arya an easy, smoothly paved road. She left her a tangled legal battle, a historic inn requiring immense physical labor, and a heavy, tarnished brass compass. Spiritually, this embodies the ultimate goal of parenting. We cannot map out our children's entire lives. We cannot shield them from every storm, nor can we buy their way out of adversity. What we can do is hand them an internal moral compass. We can teach them integrity, grit, self-sufficiency, and compassion. If these reflections resonate with the quiet truths of your own life, and if you find value in exploring the deep, complicated dynamics of family and resilience, please take a moment to follow our channel, Maria Tells Stories. We are building a community dedicated to uncovering the wisdom hidden in our everyday struggles, and we would be honored to have you walk this path of understanding with us. As you look around your own living room tonight, release the desperate need to mold your children into trophies that validate your own success. They are not extensions of your ego. They are independent, beautiful souls entrusted to your temporary care. Focus your energy on building a foundation of radical honesty and unconditional acceptance, because eventually the dark clouds will gather on the horizon and the cold winds of life will rattle the windows of your home. When that inevitable storm rolls in, the children who thrive will not be the ones who are artificially shielded from the cold. They will be the ones who were taught how to read the compass, how to weather the wind, and how to keep their own light burning in the dark. The question remains, when the storm finally breaks upon your shores, what will your children hold in their hands?